Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Story 1. My name is David. I'm 34, and I recognize the lullaby at Cascade River State Park from a house that never had a child. The RV lurched as I pulled into the campsite, dust swirling behind us like ghosts fleeing daylight. Sarah was already unbuckling her seatbelt before I'd even killed the engine, eager to stretch her legs after the 5-hour drive from Minneapolis. Our golden retriever, Murphy, pressed his nose against the window, tail wagging at the sight of endless pine trees stretching toward Lake Superior's distant shores. "This is perfect," Sarah breathed, stepping out into the crisp October air. The aspen leaves had already turned golden, and they rustled overhead with a sound like paper being shuffled. "Look at this place, David. It's like we have the whole forest to ourselves." She wasn't wrong. The state park was practically deserted this late in the season, most of the summer campers long gone. Only a handful of sites showed signs of occupation, their fire rings cold and dark. Our site sat at the end of a gravel loop, backed against a wall of ancient white pines that seemed to lean inward, creating a natural amphitheater around our RV. I'd chosen this place deliberately. After the miscarriage 3 months ago, Sarah had been different, quieter. She'd stare out windows for hours, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly before she'd catch herself and pull it away. The doctors said it was normal, that grief took time, but I could see something eating at her from the inside. This trip was supposed to help, a chance to get away from the nursery we'd painted but never used, from the baby clothes still folded in dresser drawers. "Let me get the utilities hooked up," I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. "Then we can take Murphy for a walk before dark." The electrical hookup was straightforward enough, though the post seemed older than the others I'd seen. The metal was pitted and stained, and someone had carved initials deep into the wood, JM plus EL, 1987, with a heart between them. Below that, in fresher cuts, someone had scratched "They took her" in jagged letters. Probably teenagers, I told myself, though something about the desperate angles of the letters made my skin crawl. Murphy had already claimed a spot under the picnic table, panting happily as he watched Sarah unpack our camping chairs. She moved with mechanical precision, arranging everything just so, the way she'd been doing everything since we lost the baby. Like if she could just control the small things, maybe the big ones wouldn't hurt so much. "There's a trailhead just past that stand of birch trees," I said, reading from the park map. "Cascade River Trail. Supposed to be beautiful this time of year." Sarah looked up from folding a blanket, her dark hair catching the late afternoon light. For a moment, she almost smiled. "That sounds nice. Murphy could use the exercise." The trail was indeed beautiful, winding along the rushing Cascade River as it tumbled toward Lake Superior in a series of waterfalls and rapids. Murphy bounded ahead, nose to the ground, while Sarah and I walked in comfortable silence. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, with an underlying freshness from the river spray. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Sarah stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she asked, tilting her head. I paused, listening. The river gurgled and splashed below us, and wind sighed through the pine boughs overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the water. "Hear what?" It sounded like... She frowned, then shook her head. "Never mind. I thought I heard singing." Murphy had stopped too, his ears pricked forward. He was staring into the trees off the trail, his body tense. A low whine escaped his throat. "Probably just other hikers," I said, though I'd seen no other cars in the parking area. "Come on, boy." But Murphy wouldn't move. He stood frozen, staring into the darkening woods with an intensity that made the hair on my arms rise. Then, as suddenly as it had started, whatever had caught his attention seemed to pass. He shook himself and trotted back to us, tail wagging again. We made it back to the RV just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I started a fire in the ring while Sarah heated soup on the propane stove. Murphy curled up beside my chair, content to watch the flames dance and snap. This was a good idea, Sarah said softly, settling into her chair with a steaming mug. I feel more relaxed than I have in months. I reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were cold despite the warmth from the fire. I love you, I said. I love you too. She squeezed my hand, then released it to pet Murphy's head. Remember when we used to talk about bringing kids camping? Teaching them to roast marshmallows and identify constellations? My throat tightened. Sarah, I know we're not supposed to talk about it, but being out here, it makes me think about all the things we planned. Her voice was steady, but I could see the tears reflecting the firelight. Do you think we'll ever try again? Before I could answer, a sound drifted through the trees. Faint at first, then growing clearer. A woman's voice, singing. Hush, now, my baby. Don't you cry. Mama's gonna sing you a lullaby. Close your little eyes so tight. Sleep until the morning light. Sarah's face went white. She gripped the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles showed pale against her skin. That's the song my grandmother used to sing, she whispered. The one I was going to sing to. The singing continued, drifting closer. The voice was sweet and clear, but there was something wrong with it. It echoed strangely, as if coming from multiple directions at once. Murphy started whining again, pressing himself against my legs. Rock-a-bye baby in the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. And down will come, baby, cradle and all. David, Sarah stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair. Someone's out there. Someone's singing my grandmother's song. I stood too, peering into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. The trees seemed to press closer in the flickering light, their shadows dancing like living things. I don't see anyone. Maybe it's carrying from another campsite. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The other campsites were too far away, and the voice seemed to come from the forest itself, from the spaces between the trees where the darkness gathered thick as wool. The singing stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the crackle of our fire and the distant murmur of the river. But somehow, the silence felt worse than the song. I want to go inside, Sarah said, already moving toward the RV. I doused the fire and gathered our things, Murphy close at my heels. As I climbed the steps into the RV, I could have sworn I heard the singing again. So faint it might have been my imagination. Or the wind in the pines. Inside, Sarah had already changed into her pajamas and was sitting on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair with mechanical strokes. Her hands shook slightly. It was probably just campers, I said, though the words felt hollow even to me. Sound travels funny out here at night. That was grandmother's song, David, the exact melody. She made it up herself when I was little. Sarah set down the brush and looked at me, her eyes wide and frightened. How could someone else know it? I didn't have an answer for that. I busied myself checking the locks on the door and windows, making sure everything was secure. Murphy had already claimed his spot on his bed near the front of the RV, but he kept lifting his head, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. We went to bed early, both of us exhausted from the drive and the strange tension that had settled over our campsite. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. A branch scraping against the RV's roof, the soft thud of a pine cone falling, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Normal camping sounds, but they seemed amplified in the darkness, each one making my heart race. Beside me, Sarah tossed restlessly, occasionally murmuring in her sleep. Once, I could have sworn she hummed a few bars of that lullaby. I must have finally dozed, because I woke to Murphy's low growling. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m. Murphy stood rigid beside the bed, staring toward the front windows, his hackles raised. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, not wanting to wake Sarah. Murphy whined softly, then padded to the window and pressed his nose against the glass. I slipped out of bed and joined him, peering out into the night. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. The fire had long since died to cold ashes, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out shapes moving between the trees. At first, I thought it might be deer or other wildlife, but these shapes moved too deliberately, too purposefully. They were people, or at least they had the rough outline of people. They moved slowly through the trees surrounding our campsite, never coming close enough for me to see clearly, but always there, always moving. I counted at least 6 distinct figures, maybe more, drifting like smoke through the pines. One of them stopped directly across from our RV, perhaps 50 feet away. Even in the darkness, I could feel it watching us. My heart hammered against my ribs as I strained to make out details. The figure seemed to be wearing something long and flowing, like a dress or nightgown. Its hair hung loose around its shoulders. Then it raised its hand and waved. I jerked back from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I looked again, the figure was gone. All of them were gone, leaving only the empty forest and the weight of unseen eyes. "David?" Sarah's voice was thick with sleep. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I lied, crawling back into bed. Murphy heard something outside, probably just raccoons. But I lay awake for the rest of the night, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to convince myself that what I'd seen had been a dream. When dawn finally came, painting the sky pale gray beyond the windows, I was exhausted but relieved. Whatever had been out there in the darkness was gone now. I dressed quietly and took Murphy outside to relieve himself, half expecting to find footprints in the soft earth around our campsite. But there was nothing. The pine needles and fallen leaves showed no sign of disturbance. Even our own footprints from the night before seemed strangely faded, as if the forest had already begun to erase our presence. Sarah emerged from the RV as I was starting coffee on the camp stove, her hair tousled and her eyes still puffy from sleep. "How did you sleep?" I asked. Strangely, she accepted a mug of coffee gratefully. "I kept having dreams about babies crying. And that song. I heard it all night in my dreams. A chill ran down my spine. Just dreams, though." "Just dreams," she agreed, but her voice carried no conviction. We ate breakfast in relative silence, both of us stealing glances at the tree line. Murphy seemed calmer in the daylight, though he still occasionally lifted his head as if listening for something only he could hear. "Want to try a different trail today?" I suggested. "The map shows one that goes up to an overlook. Supposed to have great views of the lake." Sarah nodded, clearly eager to get away from our campsite. We packed water and snacks, leashed Murphy, and set off for the Superior hiking trail that would take us up the ridge above Cascade River. The hike was beautiful, winding through stands of maple and oak that blazed with fall color. Murphy seemed happier too, bounding ahead to investigate interesting scents and chase the occasional chipmunk. For a while, it felt like a normal camping trip again. Sarah even laughed when Murphy tried to chase a squirrel up a tree, barking indignantly when it escaped to the higher branches. The overlook was everything the guidebook had promised. Lake Superior stretched endlessly to the horizon, its surface dark blue and choppy in the October wind. Far below, we could see the Cascade River threading its way through the valley toward the lake. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, sitting on a bench someone had placed at the viewpoint. "I can see why people come here. People have been coming here for a long time," a voice said behind us. We turned to see an elderly man approaching from the trail. He was probably in his 70s, with white hair and a deeply lined face weathered by years of outdoor living. He wore an old flannel shirt and carried a walking stick carved from what looked like birchwood. "Beautiful view," I said politely. "Indeed." The man joined us at the overlook, breathing heavily from the climb. "Name's Earl. I've been hiking these trails for 40 years. Seen a lot of changes." "Changes?" Sarah asked. Earl nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant lake. "Used to be, this whole area was Ojibwe territory. They considered it sacred land. Had stories about spirits in the forest, guardians of the dead." He glanced at us, his pale blue eyes sharp despite his age. "Of course, most folks don't believe in that sort of thing anymore." "What kind of stories?" The question came from Sarah before I could stop her. "Oh, the usual. Ghosts of children who died before their time, wandering the forest looking for their families. Spirits that sing lullabies to lure the living into the woods." Earl's voice was casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "They say if you hear the singing, it means someone's trying to cross over. Someone who died with unfinished business." My mouth went dry. Beside me, Sarah had gone very still. Just stories, of course, Earl continued, though I've met more than a few campers over the years who swore they heard things in the night. Singing, crying, the sound of children playing where no children should be. Have you ever heard anything? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Earl studied her for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Once, he said finally, about 10 years ago, I was camping down by the river, and I woke up to the sound of a woman singing. Most beautiful voice I'd ever heard, but it made my blood run cold. Sounded like grief itself had found a voice. What did you do? I asked, despite myself. Packed up and left at first light, Earl said matter-of-factly. Been camping these woods for decades, and that was the first time I felt unwelcome. Like I was intruding on something private. He shouldered his pack. Well, I should be getting back. You folks be careful down there. October's when the spirits are strongest, they say. Something about the changing seasons. The boundary between worlds getting thin. He started back down the trail, then paused and looked back at us. If you do hear singing, don't follow it. That's how they get you. Promise something you want to hear more than anything else, then lead you so deep into the woods you never find your way back. With that cheerful thought, he disappeared down the trail, leaving us alone with the wind and the vast expanse of the lake. He's just a crazy old man, I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. Is he? Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the overlook. What if there's something to it, David? What if the singing last night... Sarah, don't. I caught her arm gently. You're letting grief play tricks on your mind. There's no such thing as ghosts. How do you know? She turned to face me, tears streaming down her cheeks. How do you know our baby isn't out there somewhere trying to find us? Trying to come home? The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah, I felt her moving, David. For weeks, I felt her moving inside me. She was real. She was alive. And then, she sobbed, pressing her hands to her belly. What if she's lost? What if she's looking for me? I pulled her into my arms, feeling her shake against my chest. She's at peace, Sarah. She's not lost. She's not wandering in the woods. You have to believe that. But as I held her, I couldn't shake the memory of that figure in the darkness, raising its hand in what might have been greeting, or beckoning. We made it back to the campsite in time for a late lunch, but the mood had been shattered. Sarah picked at her sandwich, staring into the middle distance, while Murphy lay at her feet with his head on his paws. Even he seemed to sense the heaviness that had settled over us. Maybe we should cut the trip short, I suggested. Head home tonight. No, Sarah's voice was firm. I want to stay. I need to stay. Sarah, I'm not running away from this, David. If there's even a chance that something of her is here. She trailed off, but I could see the desperate hope in her eyes. She's not here, I said as gently as I could. She's gone, Sarah. We both know that. Do we? Sarah stood up abruptly. I'm going for a walk. I need some time alone. I'll come with you. No, please. I need to think. Before I could protest, she was walking toward the trees, following a faint path that led deeper into the forest. Murphy started to follow her, but I caught his collar. Stay, boy. I watched until she disappeared among the pines, anxiety gnawing at my gut. The old man's words echoed in my mind. Promise something you want to hear more than anything else, then lead you so deep into the woods you never find your way back. Sarah wanted to find our daughter more than anything else in the world. If something was out there, something that could offer her that impossible promise, I tried to distract myself by organizing our gear, cleaning up from lunch, checking the weather forecast on my phone. But the bars were weak this far from town and the forecast wouldn't load. The screen showed only a spinning wheel and the words, "Searching for service." An hour passed, then 2. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I called Sarah's name but heard only my own voice echoing back to me. Murphy whined and paced by the tree line, clearly wanting to follow Sarah's scent. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. Come on, boy, let's find her. The path Sarah had taken was barely visible, more of a game trail than anything meant for humans. It wound through thick stands of pine and birch, occasionally crossing small clearings where wildflowers had gone to seed. Murphy's nose was to the ground, following Sarah's scent with determined focus. We'd been walking for perhaps 30 minutes when I heard it again. The singing. Sleep, my baby. Close your eyes. Mama's here to dry your cries. In the forest, safe and sound, peace and comfort will be found. It was the same voice from the night before, but clearer now, more distinct. And it was coming from ahead of us, from the direction Sarah had gone. Murphy whined and pressed against my legs, reluctant to continue. But I pushed forward, calling Sarah's name. The singing grew louder, and I began to make out words I hadn't heard before. Lost little lamb, come follow me. To where the pines and shadows meet, your precious one is waiting there, beyond the veil, beyond despair. Sarah, I shouted, breaking into a run. Murphy bounded after me, barking anxiously. The trail crested a small hill and dropped into a circular clearing I hadn't seen on any map. Ancient pines ringed the space like sentinels, their trunks easily 6 feet across. In the center of the clearing stood Sarah, but she wasn't alone. A woman in a white dress stood before her, singing softly. The woman's back was to me, her long dark hair flowing loose around her shoulders. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, though there was something timeless about her posture, the way she held herself. Sarah was transfixed, staring at the woman with an expression of desperate longing. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. It was the first real smile I'd seen from her in months. "Sarah," I called, but she didn't seem to hear me. The woman in white stopped singing and slowly turned toward me. My breath caught in my throat. Her face was beautiful but wrong, somehow, like a photograph slightly out of focus. Her eyes were dark hollows, and when she smiled, I saw too many teeth. "She can't hear you," the woman said, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "She's listening to something much more important." "Who are you?" I demanded, taking a step forward. Murphy growled low in his throat, his hackles raised. "I'm a mother, like her." The woman's smile widened impossibly. "I know what it's like to lose a child. The emptiness, the hunger for just one more moment, one more touch. Sarah, we're leaving, now." I reached for her arm, but she pulled away without looking at me. "She's here," Sarah whispered, her eyes never leaving the woman in white. "Our daughter. She's here, David. I can feel her." "Where?" The woman gestured toward the trees. "She's just beyond the veil, waiting for her mother to come for her. All you have to do is follow." "That's impossible," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt a chill run down my spine. Because there was something else in the clearing now. Something small and pale moving between the trees at the edge of my vision. "Is it?" The woman tilted her head, studying me with those hollow eyes. "Death is just another country, David, and countries have borders. Sometimes those borders can be crossed." Sarah took a step toward the trees, and I saw what had caught her attention. A small figure stood among the pines, barely visible in the growing shadows. It was child-sized, maybe 2 or 3 years old, wearing what looked like a white nightgown. "Emma?" Sarah's voice broke on the name we'd chosen for our daughter. The small figure raised its arms, the universal gesture of a child wanting to be picked up. And for a moment, just a moment, I wanted to believe. I wanted to believe that somehow, impossibly, our daughter was here, waiting for us in this impossible place. Then Murphy let out a bark that was half howl, and the spell broke. The child figure flickered like a candle flame in the wind, and I saw what it really was. Not a child at all, but something else entirely. Something that wore the shape of a child like an ill-fitting costume. "Sarah, that's not her." I grabbed her arm, harder this time. "That's not Emma." "Of course it is." Sarah tried to pull away, but I held firm. "Look at her, David. She has my eyes." But when I looked, the figure had no eyes at all. Just dark holes in a face that shifted and blurred whenever I tried to focus on it. "She's been waiting for you," the woman in white continued, moving closer to Sarah. Up close, I could see that her dress was stained with what looked like old blood, and her skin had the waxy pallor of something long dead. waiting in the cold and the dark. "Don't you want to hold her again?" "Yes," Sarah breathed, and I felt her slipping away from me, drawn by a need deeper than reason. "Then come." The woman held out her hand. "Come, and never be apart again." Sarah reached toward the outstretched hand, and I knew that if she took it, I would lose her forever. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted, it wasn't offering reunion. It was offering damnation. I did the only thing I could think of. I scooped up a handful of dirt and pine needles and threw it at the woman in white. The effect was immediate and horrible. The woman shrieked, a sound like rusty metal tearing, and her beautiful facade collapsed. For just an instant, I saw what she really was, something ancient and hungry with skin like bark and teeth like thorns. Then she was gone, dissolving into shadow and wind. The child figure vanished too, leaving only the whisper of wind through the pines. Sarah collapsed, sobbing as if waking from a dream. "Where is she? Where did she go?" "She was never here," I said, gathering her into my arms. "Sarah, what you saw, it wasn't real." "But I felt her," Sarah wept. "I felt her reach for me." Murphy pressed against us both, whining softly. Around us, the clearing seemed to darken rapidly, as if the sun had suddenly set. The ancient pines creaked and swayed, though I felt no wind. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." I helped Sarah to her feet and we stumbled back toward the trail. But something was wrong. The path we'd followed into the clearing was gone. Where it should have been, there was only unbroken forest, thick with underbrush and fallen logs. "David," Sarah's voice was small and frightened. "How do we get back?" I turned in a slow circle, Murphy staying close to my legs. The clearing was surrounded by identical walls of pine, with no visible way out. The trees seemed taller now, their branches interlocking overhead to block out the sky. Only a few faint beams of light penetrated the canopy, creating a dim, green twilight. "There." I pointed to what looked like a gap between two massive pine trunks. "I think the trail is through there." But as we approached, the gap seemed to close, the trees shifting subtly to block our way. I tried another direction, then another, but each potential exit melted away as we neared it. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered. A new sound filled the clearing. Laughter, high and sweet and terrible. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the pine bark and drifting down from the hidden sky. "You threw dirt at me," a voice said, amused and cold. "How delightfully primitive." The woman in white materialized in front of us, but she made no attempt to hide her true nature now. Her skin was mottled gray and brown like a diseased tree, and her hair writhed with a life of its own. Her dress was revealed to be made of something that might have been spider silk, or might have been dried skin. "Did you really think a handful of earth would be enough to banish me?" She laughed again. "I am older than these trees, older than the rivers that carved these valleys. I was here when the first humans walked these forests, and I will be here when the last human dies." "What do you want?" I demanded, pulling Sarah behind me. "What I've always wanted, what I was denied." Her hollow eyes fixed on Sarah. "I want a child to love, a child to sing to, a child to hold in the long, dark nights." "You can't have her," I said. "Can't I?" The thing that wore a woman's shape smiled. "Look around you, David. You're in my domain now, my sacred grove. Here, I make the rules." As if to prove her point, the ground beneath our feet began to shift and ripple like water. Murphy yelped as he sank to his belly in what had been solid earth moments before. "I don't want to hurt you," the creature continued, her voice almost reasonable. "You can leave. Walk away and never look back. But she stays with me. She wants to stay, don't you, Sarah?" I felt Sarah tense behind me, and for a horrible moment, I thought she might actually agree. The promise of holding our daughter again, even in this twisted form, might be enough to make her abandon everything else. "No," Sarah said quietly but firmly. "No, I won't stay. Whatever you are, whatever you're offering, it's not real. It's not her." The creature's face contorted with rage. "Ungrateful! Do you know how many mothers would give anything for what I offer? How many have already joined me in my grove?" That's when I noticed them. pale shapes moving between the trees, women in various stages of decay, all wearing expressions of terrible loss. Some were recent, their clothes modern, their faces still recognizable as human. Others were older, their flesh mummified, their clothing rotted to tatters. All of them had the same hollow, desperate look in their eyes. "They all came to me in grief," the creature said, following my gaze, "all seeking what had been taken from them, and I gave them what they wanted, the promise of reunion, the hope of holding their lost children again. In exchange for such a small thing." "Their lives," I said. "Such a small thing," the creature repeated. "Life is pain, David. I offer an end to pain." The trapped women began to move closer, reaching toward us with skeletal fingers. Murphy growled and snapped at one that came too near, his teeth passing through her like smoke. "Sarah," I whispered, "when I say run, head for the biggest pine tree, the one with the split trunk. I think there's a gap behind it." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." I was lying, of course. Someone had to distract the creature and her collection of grieving mothers. But I couldn't tell Sarah that. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Sarah toward the tree line. She stumbled, then broke into a sprint, Murphy bounding after her. The spectral women moved to intercept them, but I threw myself into their path, swinging my hiking stick like a club. It passed through them harmlessly, but it seemed to confuse them. Buy Sarah a few precious seconds. The creature shrieked and rushed toward me, her form shifting and growing until she towered 10 feet tall, her arms stretching like branches, her fingers elongating into thorns. "You cannot deny me," she screamed. "I will have what was promised." Her thorn fingers raked across my chest, leaving burning trails of pain. I stumbled backward, gasping, and felt warm blood soaking through my shirt. The creature loomed over me, her hollow eyes burning with ancient hunger. "Where is she?" she demanded. "Where is the mother?" "Gone," I gasped. "She's gone." "Impossible." The creature spun, searching the clearing. "She cannot leave my grove. No one leaves my grove." But Sarah was nowhere to be seen. Somehow, impossibly, she had found a way out. The creature turned back to me, her face twisted with rage and frustration. "Then you will take her place. You will stay and feed my grove with your grief, your loss, your endless longing for what can never be." "I don't think so," I said, and pulled out the small vial I'd been carrying in my pocket. Holy water from the church where Sarah and I had been married. I'd grabbed it on impulse from the hotel we'd stayed at the night before, thinking it might come in handy. I unscrewed the cap and threw the contents at the creature. This time, the effect was devastating. The holy water hit her like acid, and she screamed as smoke rose from her skin. Her carefully maintained form began to collapse, revealing something that hurt to look at directly. A twisted mass of roots and bones and ancient hunger. "Iron!" she gasped. "I smell iron on you. Cold iron." I looked down at my hands and realized she was right. My wedding ring, which I'd forgotten I was wearing. The old stories were true then. Iron was anathema to creatures like this. The grove began to dissolve around us. The phantom women fading like mist. The ancient pines flickering between reality and illusion. I could see the real forest now. The normal trees and underbrush. The fading daylight of an October evening. "This is not over," the creature hissed as she too began to fade. "She will return. They always return. Grief is a wound that never heals, and I am the infection that grows in its depths." Then she was gone, and I was alone in an ordinary clearing with an ordinary trail leading back toward our campsite. I ran. Sarah was waiting by the RV when I burst out of the trees, Murphy at my side. She had our gear half packed already, throwing things into bags with shaking hands. "Thank God," she sobbed when she saw me. I thought, "When you didn't come right behind me." "I'm okay," I said, though my chest burned where the creature's claws had raked me. "Are you hurt?" "No. Scared, but not hurt." She looked at the scratches on my shirt, the blood seeping through the fabric. "David, you're bleeding. It's not deep." I pulled off my shirt and examined the wounds. 4 parallel scratches across my chest, but they were already clotting. "Sarah, we need to leave. Now." "I know." She was already moving, throwing the last of our gear into the RV. I've been hearing the singing again. It's getting closer. I could hear it too now, drifting through the trees like smoke. Multiple voices this time, a chorus of loss and longing and desperate need. Come back to us, sister. Come back to the grove. Your daughter is waiting. With all of our love. Don't listen, I said, starting the engine. Whatever you hear, don't listen. We drove out of Cascade River State Park as fast as I dared on the winding gravel roads, Murphy whining anxiously in the back. In the rearview mirror, I could see figures emerging from the tree line, pale shapes in white dresses watching us go. We didn't stop until we reached Grand Marais, 20 miles down the highway. I pulled into the parking lot of a brightly lit diner and killed the engine, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. For a long moment, we just sat there in the bright fluorescent glow from the diner's windows, breathing hard and trying to process what had happened. Normal people moved past the windows, a waitress carrying coffee, a trucker reading a newspaper, a family with young children laughing over ice cream. The ordinary world going about its ordinary business, blissfully unaware of the horror we'd escaped. "David," Sarah said quietly, "what we saw back there, what was it?" I didn't have a good answer. Something old, something hungry. I touched the scratches on my chest, which had stopped bleeding but still burned. Something that feeds on grief. Sarah nodded slowly, staring out at the parking lot. I wanted to believe it so badly. When I saw that thing that looked like Emma, I wanted it to be real more than I've ever wanted anything in my life. I know. But it wasn't her. Tears started flowing again, but these were different somehow. Cleaner. Our daughter is gone, David. Really gone. And I have to accept that. I reached over and took her hand. This time, her fingers were warm. We both do. We went into the diner and ordered coffee and pie, sitting in a corner booth where we could see the RV through the windows. Murphy waited patiently in the parking lot, though I could see him scanning the tree line beyond the highway, alert for threats. "Where do we go from here?" Sarah asked, picking at her apple pie. "Home," I said. "We go home, and we figure out how to live with what we've lost. We try again, maybe, when we're ready. Will we ever be ready? I don't know. But we'll face it together." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since before the miscarriage. Together. We finished our pie and got back on the road, driving through the night toward Minneapolis. Neither of us wanted to spend another night in the woods, not after what we'd experienced. The highway was a ribbon of light cutting through the darkness, other travelers' headlights like distant stars. It was nearly dawn when we pulled into our driveway. The house looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile somehow, but it was ours. Our sanctuary. Our refuge from the hungry darkness that lurked in wild places. I helped Sarah carry our bags inside while Murphy explored the yard, relieving himself after the long drive and checking for any changes in his territory. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. The newspaper still on the kitchen counter, the coffee mug I'd forgotten to put in the dishwasher, Sarah's book open on the coffee table. "I'm going to take a shower," Sarah said. "Wash the forest off." "Good idea." While she showered, I stood in the doorway of what would have been the nursery. We'd painted it yellow, wanting to be surprised by the baby's gender. The crib was still assembled, the mobile hanging motionless above it. Stuffed animals sat in a neat row on the changing table, waiting for a child who would never come. For the first time since the miscarriage, the sight didn't fill me with rage or despair. Instead, I felt something like peace. Our daughter was gone, but she had been loved. She had been wanted. She had been real, if only for a short time. That was enough. It had to be enough. I closed the door gently and went to join Sarah in our bedroom. She was already in bed, her hair damp from the shower, wearing the old t-shirt she'd claimed from my closet years ago. "Are you okay?" I asked, sliding in beside her. "I think so. For the first time in months, I think I actually am." She curled against me, her head on my chest. That thing in the forest. It wasn't offering me my daughter back. It was offering me a different kind of death, a way to stop hurting by stopping living. "But you chose to live." "We chose to live." She lifted her head to look at me. Both of us, even when it would have been easier to let that thing have what it wanted. I held her close, feeling her breath against my neck, her heart beating steady and strong against my ribs. Outside, dawn was breaking over the suburbs, painting our bedroom walls with soft golden light. We slept deeply that day, the sleep of the living. But even in sleep, I dreamed of pale figures in white dresses, standing at the edge of the forest, waiting, watching, calling to anyone who might listen. The creature had been right about one thing. Grief was a wound that never fully healed, but wounds could scar over, become part of you without defining you. They could make you stronger, more compassionate, more aware of how precious and fragile life truly was. 3 months later, Sarah started volunteering at a grief counseling center, helping other women who had lost pregnancies. She was good at it, able to offer the kind of understanding that only came from walking through that particular darkness and finding your way back to the light. We never talked about having children again, but we didn't close the door on it either. Some conversations could wait until we were ready to have them. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was just right, I would hear something that might have been singing drifting through our bedroom windows, and Sarah would stir in her sleep, reaching unconsciously toward a sound that promised impossible things. On those nights, I would get up and check the locks, make sure all the windows were closed, turn on every light in the house, because I knew that somewhere in the deep woods of Minnesota, an ancient hunger still waited in the shadows between the trees. It waited for the grieving, the desperate, the ones who wanted something so badly they would trade everything for the promise of having it back. It waited with endless patience because it knew that grief was a constant in the human experience, renewable as the seasons. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the pain was fresh and the longing was strong, people would hear the singing and follow it into the woods. They would find the grove where the ancient trees grew, where promises were made and prices were paid. Most never came back. Those who did were never quite the same. They carried something with them, a shadow that clung to their footsteps, a hollow look in their eyes that never quite went away. They knew something the rest of us didn't, that in the spaces between the living world and whatever lay beyond, things with too many teeth and not enough mercy waited for the chance to feed. Sarah kept a small silver cross on her nightstand now, blessed water in a vial by our bed. We both wore iron rings alongside our wedding bands. Cold iron, the old protection against things that should not be. Because we had learned that some wounds in the world never healed. Some hungers never died. And some lullabies, once heard, echoed forever in the chambers of the heart. The forest remembered everything. The pines remembered the taste of tears, the sound of desperate mothers calling children who would never answer. They remembered promises made in the darkness, and they were patient. They could wait. After all, everyone grieved something eventually. Everyone lost something precious. And when they did, when the pain became too much to bear, they might find themselves drawn to wild places where ancient things dwelt in the shadows. They might hear singing in the wind, and some of them might follow it home. I wake up sometimes, even now, to the sound of Murphy growling low in his throat. He's older now, grayer around the muzzle, but his instincts are still sharp. When he growls like that, pressing himself against the bedroom door, I know something is moving in the darkness outside our house. Something that remembers the taste of our grief. Something that's still hungry. On those nights, I hold Sarah close and listen to her breathing, steady and peaceful in sleep. I count her heartbeats, grateful for each one, and I wait for dawn. Because dawn always comes, eventually. The light always returns to drive back the shadows and the hungry things that dwell within them. But the darkness returns too, regular as clockwork. And with it comes the memory of pale figures in white dresses, standing at the edge of perception, singing their terrible lullabies to anyone desperate enough to listen. The pines remember everything, and they're still singing. Story 2. My name is Marcus. I'm 34, and the first set of footprints at Olympic National Forest stopped where mine began. I should have turned around right then, should have listened to the ice-cold dread that shot through my chest when I saw those bare human prints in the mud, toes splayed wide like something had been running. But Sarah was already unpacking the RV, humming that off-key tune she always hummed when she was happy, and I couldn't bring myself to ruin her first real vacation in 3 years. We'd driven 12 hours straight from Portland to reach the Salt Duke Hot Springs area, our 28-foot Winnebago groaning up those mountain switchbacks like an old man climbing stairs. Sarah had picked this spot from some camping blog. Hidden Gem, she'd called it. Barely anyone knows about the dispersed camping sites off Forest Road 2918. The isolation had appealed to us both. After the year we'd had, the thought of being completely alone in the Washington wilderness felt like medicine. The footprints were about 50 yards from where we'd parked, leading from the tree line toward our campsite and then just stopping, like whoever made them had simply vanished into thin air. The last print was deeper than the others. Heel dug in like they'd pushed off hard, but there was nothing beyond it. No disturbed vegetation, no continuation of the trail, nothing. "Marcus, come help me with the awning," Sarah called from beside the RV. She wore that yellow sundress I'd bought her for her birthday, the one that made her look younger than her 31 years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she had that excited gleam in her eyes that I hadn't seen since before her father died. I forced myself to look away from the prints. "Coming, babe." We'd been together for 6 years, married for 3, and I knew Sarah well enough to read the subtle tension in her shoulders as we set up camp. The drive had been long, yes, but something else was bothering her. She kept glancing toward the trees, and twice I caught her mid-conversation, staring at nothing. "You okay?" I asked as we unfurled the RV's awning. "Fine, just this place feels familiar somehow." She shrugged, but her grip on the awning pole was white-knuckled. Probably just déjà vu. The campsite was perfect, I had to admit. A small clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks, with a fire ring someone had built from river stones. A creek babbled somewhere in the distance, and the air smelled like pine needles and that clean, sharp scent of mountains. Our nearest neighbors were at least 2 miles away, back down the forest road. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, we built our first fire. Sarah had brought ingredients for s'mores, something we hadn't done since we were dating, and for a moment everything felt normal. She laughed at my terrible jokes. We talked about maybe getting a dog, and I almost forgot about those strange footprints. Almost. Because as the flames danced higher, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Our shadows, cast by the firelight against the RV's white siding, were moving normally. But there was a third shadow, longer and thinner than ours, that seemed to move a half-second behind the others. When I turned my head left, this shadow turned left. When I raised my arm, it raised its arm. But always that tiny delay, like it was copying rather than creating. "Sarah," I said quietly, "look at our shadows." She followed my gaze and went very still. For a long moment, we both watched our 2 shadows dance with their mysterious third companion. "It's probably just the fire," she whispered, but her voice shook. "You know how flames can play tricks." I stood up abruptly, and the third shadow stood too. A fraction of a second later, I waved my arms, and it waved back, always that tiny delay. Sarah grabbed my hand, her palm slick with sweat. "Let's go inside," she said. We doused the fire and retreated into the RV. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft patter of something moving through the underbrush, made us both tense. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps circling the RV, but when I peered through the window, I saw nothing but darkness. I woke to Sarah shaking me roughly. Gray morning light filtered through the RV's small windows, and she was already dressed. "Marcus, you need to see this." Outside, the world looked different. Where yesterday the forest had seemed welcoming, now it felt watchful. The trees seemed closer somehow, leaning in toward our campsite. But what Sarah wanted to show me was worse than the subtle shift in atmosphere. All around our RV, pressed into the soft earth, were dozens of footprints. Human footprints, all different sizes, some barefoot, others in boots or sneakers. They circled our campsite in concentric rings, like some kind of ritual dance had taken place while we slept. What the hell? I knelt beside the nearest set of prints. They were fresh, made sometime during the night while the ground was still damp from dew. Sarah, how many people do you think? Count them, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I started at the outermost ring and worked my way inward, counting distinct footprint patterns. Children's feet, adult feet, feet so large they couldn't possibly be human. By the time I finished, I'd counted 37 different sets of prints. 37 people had surrounded our RV in the night, walking in silent circles while we slept. We're leaving, Sarah said, right now. But when I turned the key in the RV's ignition, nothing happened. Not even a click. I tried again, pumping the gas pedal. Nothing. The engine was fine yesterday, I muttered, popping the hood, but everything looked normal. Battery cables secure. No obvious damage. I tried the radio to call for help, but got only static. Our phones, Sarah said, digging hers from her purse. The screen was black, completely dead despite being fully charged the night before. Mine was the same. We were stranded. Okay, I said, fighting to keep my voice calm. Okay, we can walk out. It's only 2 miles to the main road and someone will come by eventually. But as we packed emergency supplies and prepared to hike out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints that had circled our RV during the night. They weren't just random. Looking at them from above, they formed a pattern. Concentric circles with symbols pressed into the earth between them. Symbols that looked almost like letters, but in no alphabet I recognized. We started walking just after noon, following the dirt road back toward civilization. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no insect buzz. Even the wind seemed muted. Our footsteps sounded impossibly loud on the packed earth. "This is the right way, isn't it?" Sarah asked after we'd been walking for about 30 minutes. I checked my compass, but the needle spun wildly, never settling on any direction. I think so. The road only goes one way. But as we continued walking, I began to have doubts. The road seemed longer than I remembered, winding through stands of trees that looked increasingly unfamiliar. Worse, I started noticing things that shouldn't have been there. Trail markers nailed to trees with messages in that same strange alphabet, cairns of stacked stones that definitely hadn't been there yesterday, and always, the feeling of being watched. After what felt like hours of walking, we crested a small hill and saw our RV in the clearing below. "That's impossible," Sarah breathed. We'd been walking in a straight line down the only road, but somehow we'd ended up back where we started. The circle of footprints was still there, now looking more like a trap than a mystery. "We must have gotten turned around," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. We'd followed the road. There had been no turns, no forks, nowhere we could have gone wrong. "Marcus," Sarah's voice was small and frightened. "Look." She was pointing at the ground near our feet. In the soft earth beside the road were 2 sets of fresh footprints. Ours, from when we'd walked this way an hour ago. But mixed in with them were other prints, made at the same time. Prints that matched our shoes exactly, walking right alongside us step for step. We'd been shadowed on our walk by something wearing our exact footprints. The sun was getting lower, and neither of us wanted to be caught outside after dark. We retreated to the RV, locking the door and pulling the curtains closed. I tried the engine again. Still nothing. The radio produced only that endless, maddening static. "What do you think they want?" Sarah asked. She was sitting on the small couch, hugging her knees to her chest. "I don't know. Maybe they're just curious about us. People don't walk in ritual circles around strangers because they're curious, Marcus." She was right, of course. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't benign curiosity. The precision of those footprint patterns, the way our electronics had failed, the impossible loop of the road, none of it felt random. As darkness fell, we heard them again. Footsteps circling the RV, dozens of them, keeping perfect rhythm like a marching band. But this time, we also heard voices, whispers in a language I didn't recognize, punctuated occasionally by sounds that might have been laughter. I risked a peek through the curtains and immediately wished I hadn't. They were there, just beyond the reach of our battery-powered lantern. Figures in the darkness, walking in those same concentric circles. But something was wrong with them. They moved too smoothly, like they were gliding rather than walking, and their proportions seemed off. Too tall or too thin, or arms that hung too long at their sides. "Don't look," I told Sarah, but she was already at the window beside me. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, Marcus, that one looks like my father." I looked where she was pointing and saw a figure in the outer ring. A heavy-set man with salt and pepper hair wearing a flannel shirt I recognized. Sarah's father had been buried in that exact shirt 8 months ago. "It's not him," I said quickly. "It can't be him." But as the figure passed closer to our window, it turned its head toward us and smiled with Sarah's father's face. Not quite right. The smile was too wide, the eyes too bright, but unmistakably him. Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal and stumbled backward from the window. "That's not possible. He's dead. I watched them put him in the ground." The walking continued until dawn, and with it, the whispers. Sometimes I thought I could almost understand what they were saying, but whenever I tried to focus on the words, they slipped away like water through my fingers. When morning came, the figures were gone, but they'd left more than footprints this time. Arranged around our RV were personal items. Sarah's father's reading glasses, impossible because we'd buried him with them. My college class ring, which I was sure was in a drawer back home. A child's stuffed rabbit I didn't recognize. Dozens of small objects that seemed to carry emotional weight. "They're not just copying our footprints," Sarah said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "They're copying our lives." We tried walking out again, with the same result. No matter which direction we went, no matter how carefully we marked our path, we always ended up back at the RV. The forest had become a maze with only one room, and we were trapped in the center of it. On the third night, they got bolder. The walking began earlier, just after sunset, and this time they were singing. Haunting melodies that seemed to come from everywhere at once, harmonies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Sarah curled up on the couch with her hands pressed over her ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside our heads as much as outside. Around midnight, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. It stretched on, thick and expectant, until I couldn't stand it anymore. Against my better judgment, I crept to the window and looked out. They were all standing perfectly still, facing our RV. Dozens of figures in the darkness, motionless as statues. But as I watched, they began to move again. Not walking this time, but swaying back and forth in unison like wheat in a breeze. And they were getting closer. The outer ring of figures stepped forward in perfect synchronization. Then the next ring. Then the next. Each step brought them near to our RV, and with each step, I could see them more clearly in the pale moonlight. They wore our faces. Not copies or approximations, but our actual faces. Sarah's father was there, yes, but so was Sarah herself. A perfect duplicate standing among the swaying figures. And there was another me, tall and thin with my exact features, swaying with the rest. I looked at Sarah on the couch and then back at the window. Both Sarahs were there. The real one, terrified and exhausted beside me, and the other one swaying in the darkness with eyes that reflected the moonlight like mirrors. "Sarah," I whispered, but she didn't respond. When I turned to look at her, I saw that she was staring at the window too, her face pale with horror. "Do you see?" I started to ask. "The one that looks like you," she said. "It's waving." I looked back outside. The figure with my face had raised one hand and was slowly waving at us, its mouth stretched in a grin too wide for any human face. As we watched, it began to walk toward the RV. "Lock the door," Sarah said. "It's already locked." "Lock it again." The figure that wore my face reached our RV and began to circle it slowly, running its fingers along the aluminum siding with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. When it reached our window, it stopped and pressed its face against the glass. It looked exactly like me, down to the small scar on my chin from a childhood accident. But its eyes were wrong. Too bright, too knowing, like it was seeing things I couldn't see. "Marcus," it said, and its voice was my voice, perfectly reproduced. "Let me in." "No," I said. "Marcus," it said again, "I'm cold out here. Let me in." Sarah grabbed my arm. "Don't answer it." But the thing wearing my face continued to speak, using my voice to say things I would never say. It told us about the forest, about the hungry darkness between the trees, about the way shadows could learn to walk and whisper and want. It talked about loneliness and the deep need to belong, about how much easier it would be if we just opened the door and joined the others. We could be together, it said, still wearing my face. All of us, walking together forever. No more fear, no more separation. Just the peace of moving in perfect harmony. The words were hypnotic, and I found myself taking a step toward the door before Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. "It's not you," she said. "Whatever it is, it's not you." The thing outside laughed with my laugh, and the sound made my skin crawl. She's right, of course. I'm much better than him. I don't have his fears, his weaknesses, his small human limitations. I could love her in ways he never could. "Stop," I said. "I could protect her from the things he can't even see. The darkness that follows them both, the shadow that's been growing longer every year. He thinks he hides it well, but I can see it. The way he looks at himself in mirrors, the way he flinches when she touches him, the way he's been pulling away ever since her father died because he doesn't know how to help her grieve." "Shut up," I said, but my voice shook because the thing was right. All of it was true. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, "don't listen to it." The thing outside pressed both hands against the window now, its face still wearing my features but somehow becoming more alien with each passing moment. "She deserves better than your uncertainty, your constant fear of not being enough. I could give her everything you can't." I looked at Sarah and saw the tears on her cheeks, saw the way she was looking at me with something that might have been recognition, or might have been fear. Because the thing outside wasn't just wearing my face, it was speaking my deepest insecurities, the thoughts I tried to hide even from myself. "Come outside, Marcus," it said. "Let me show you what you could be." "No." "Then I'll wait." It stepped back from the window, still smiling. "We're very patient. We've been waiting here for so long already. What's a little longer?" It rejoined the circle of swaying figures, and they resumed their strange dance around our RV. But now I could see that there were two of everyone. Two versions of Sarah, two of me, two of her father, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. All of them moving in perfect synchronization, all of them wearing stolen faces. We didn't sleep that night. We sat pressed together on the small couch, listening to the sound of our doppelgangers singing outside. Sometimes the thing with my face would return to the window, tapping gently on the glass and speaking in my voice about love and longing and the peace that comes with letting go. When dawn came, they faded into the trees like smoke, leaving behind only those concentric circles of footprints and the growing certainty that we were trapped in something far worse than a simple haunting. "We need to find out what they want," Sarah said over instant coffee and stale granola bars. "This isn't random. The footprints, the patterns, the way they're copying us, it has to mean something." I'd been thinking the same thing, the symbols in the footprint circles. If we could figure out what they mean. We spent the morning examining the strange markings pressed into the earth around our campsite. They definitely looked like writing, but in an alphabet neither of us recognized. Some symbols were repeated frequently, others appeared only once. There was a logic to it, a grammar, but one that operated by rules I couldn't grasp. "Wait," Sarah said, crouching beside one of the clearer impressions. "This one. I think I've seen this before." She traced the symbol with her finger. 3 curved lines intersecting in a pattern that looked almost like a Celtic knot. My dad had a book about Pacific Northwest folklore. There was a chapter about something called shadow walkers, spirits that could copy the appearance and mannerisms of the living. This symbol was supposed to be their mark. What did the book say about them? That they were trapped between life and death, unable to fully exist in either state. They could mimic the living, but they couldn't create anything new. They were hungry for life, for the ability to truly exist instead of just copying. How do you get rid of them? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. The book said you couldn't. Once they'd marked you, chosen you to copy, the only way to escape was to give them what they wanted. Which is, to take your place, completely. We stared at each other across the circle of symbols, the weight of her words settling between us like a stone. The Shadow Walkers didn't just want to copy us, they wanted to become us, and for that to happen, we would have to stop existing. That afternoon, we made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring the tree line around our campsite, looking for any clue about our situation, Sarah found a backpack half buried under a pile of rotting leaves. Inside were a driver's license, credit cards, and family photos belonging to someone named David Chen. The license was issued 3 years ago, but the photos looked much older. A young man with his girlfriend, both of them smiling in front of what looked like our exact campsite. "They've done this before," I said, studying the photos. "Others have been trapped here." We found more evidence as we searched. A child's jacket hanging from a branch, a woman's hiking boots stuck in the mud by the creek, dozens of small personal items scattered throughout the forest like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. "How many people do you think they've copied?" Sarah asked. I thought about the figures I'd seen the night before, the dozens of different faces in their circle dance. All of them. Everyone who's ever gotten lost here. As the sun began to set on our 4th day in the forest, we made a terrible decision. We couldn't escape by walking out. The forest itself seemed designed to loop us back to the campsite. Our RV wouldn't start, our phones were dead, and no one knew where we were. We had enough food and water for maybe another day, but more importantly, we were both beginning to crack under the strain. Sarah had started talking to herself, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there, and I'd begun to notice my reflection acting independently. Small movements that I wasn't making, expressions that didn't match my mood. "We have to try something different," I said as we watched the sun disappear behind the trees. "We can't just wait here for them to wear us down. What are you suggesting? Tonight, when they come, I'm going outside." "Marcus, no. Not to join them," I said quickly, "but to talk to them. To find out what they really want, maybe negotiate some kind of deal." Sarah grabbed my hands, her grip almost painful. "They want to replace us. What kind of deal could you possibly make with something like that?" "I don't know, but sitting here waiting to die isn't working either." We argued about it until the first footsteps began circling our RV, but in the end, she knew I was right. We were out of options, out of time, and out of hope. When the thing wearing my face appeared at our window again, I was ready. "I want to talk," I called out. It tilted its head, my head, to one side. "Then come outside. Here, through the window." It smiled, and the expression was so perfectly mine that it made me sick. "You're afraid." "Yes, good. Fear makes the copying easier. When you're afraid, you become more pliable." "What do you want from us?" "To exist," it said simply. "You have no idea what it's like to be caught between states, never fully real, never able to create or grow or change. We can only copy, only echo what others have made. But if we can take your place completely, you'd be us. We'd be more than you. All your memories, your experiences, your connections to the world, but without your limitations, without your fear and doubt and small human failings. And we'd be dead. You'd be free," it said, and for a moment its voice carried a note of something that might have been compassion. "Death is just another kind of existence, peaceful, quiet. No more struggling against the inevitable." Behind me, Sarah made a small sound of distress. The thing wearing my face looked past me to her, and its expression softened into something that looked genuinely caring. "She's suffered so much," it said. "Losing her father, watching you pull away from her grief because you don't know how to help. We could love her better than you do. We could take away all her pain." "Don't," I said. "She's beautiful when she sleeps," it continued. "We've been watching through the windows. She dreams about her father, about the way things used to be. We could make those dreams real for her." I turned to look at Sarah and saw that she was staring at the thing in the window with a mixture of horror and something that might have been longing. "It's not real," I told her. "Whatever it's offering, it's not real." "How do you know?" she asked quietly. How do you know what's real anymore? The thing wearing my face laughed. She's starting to understand. The boundaries aren't as solid as you think, Marcus. Life, death, real, unreal, these are just words humans use to pretend they have control over something vast and unknowable. More figures appeared at the other windows of our RV. The thing wearing Sarah's face, the one that looked like her father, dozens of others I didn't recognize. All of them were smiling. All of them were beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, and all of them were wrong. Join us, they said in unison, their voices creating a harmony that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Stop fighting. Stop suffering. Just let go. I felt the pull of their words, the seductive promise of an end to fear and uncertainty. Part of me wanted to open the door, to walk out into their circle and let them take everything that hurt. But another part of me, the part that loved Sarah more than I loved my own peace of mind, refused to give up. No, I said. The things outside stopped smiling. Then we'll wait, said the one with my face. We're very patient, and you're only human. Eventually, you'll break. They faded back into the darkness, leaving us alone with our terror and the slowly dawning realization that they were right. We were only human, and humans had limits. How long could we hold out against beings that didn't need sleep or food or hope? On the 5th night, Sarah tried to leave. I woke to the sound of the RV door opening and found her standing on the threshold in her pajamas, staring out into the darkness where the shadow walkers waited. Her movements were slow and dreamlike, and when I called her name, she didn't respond. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back inside, locking the door behind us. She blinked and looked around as if seeing the RV for the first time. I was dreaming, she said, about my dad. He was calling me. Outside, I could hear soft laughter. They're in your head now, I said. They're using your grief against you. I know. She sank onto the couch, trembling. But Marcus, what if they're right? What if this is just prolonging the inevitable? What if dying would be better than living with this fear? I sat beside her and pulled her close, feeling how thin she'd gotten over the past few days. We were both losing weight, both developing a hollow-eyed look that spoke of too little sleep and too much terror. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe they are right. Maybe we're just delaying the inevitable. But I'm not ready to give up yet. Why not? Because I love you. The real you, not some perfect copy without pain or fear. I love your grief for your father, and your terrible singing voice, and the way you get cranky when you're hungry. I love all the messy, imperfect human things about you that they could never replicate. She started crying then, not the quiet tears of exhaustion we'd both been shedding for days, but real sobs that shook her whole body. I held her and let her cry, and for the first time since we'd arrived in this place, something felt real and true and unquestionably ours. Outside, the shadow walkers resumed their circling, but their singing had taken on a different quality. Frustrated, almost angry. They were losing their hold on us, and they knew it. Dawn brought a new horror. When we looked outside, we saw that the circle of symbols around our RV had changed. New markings had been added during the night, more complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. But worse than the symbols were the figures standing perfectly still among them. Sarah's father was there, wearing the clothes we'd buried him in, but his eyes were black pits that seemed to swallow light. And beside him stood others. The young man from the photos we'd found, a woman in hiking gear, a child who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. All of them perfectly preserved. All of them watching our RV with those terrible empty eyes. They're not copies anymore, Sarah whispered. They're the real people, the ones who came before us. I realized she was right. These weren't shadow walkers wearing stolen faces. These were the actual people who had been trapped here, transformed into something that was neither fully alive nor fully dead. We have to get out of here, I said, today, before we end up like them. How? We've tried everything. Not everything. I was thinking of something I'd read in survival guides about situations where conventional logic failed. What if the road doesn't lead out because we're not supposed to use the road? What do you mean? The shadow walkers want us to stay on the path they've prepared for us. What if we go completely off trail? Straight through the forest, No roads, no marked paths. It was a desperate plan, and we both knew it. The Olympic National Forest was vast and easy to get lost in even under normal circumstances. But staying where we were meant certain death or worse, and at least this way we'd be taking action. We packed light, water, energy bars, a compass that might or might not work, and my father's old hunting knife. As we prepared to leave the RV, I noticed that our reflections in the bathroom mirror were wrong again. They moved when we moved, but their expressions were different. Hungry, anticipatory, like they were waiting for something. "Don't look," I told Sarah, but she'd already seen. "They're inside now, too," she said. "In the mirrors, in the shadows, in anything that can reflect or copy. They're everywhere." We left the RV just after noon, heading due north into the deep forest. Behind us, I could hear the sound of laughter and applause, as if the shadow walkers approved of our decision to venture into their true domain. The forest was wrong from the moment we stepped off the road. Trees grew in patterns that made no sense, spiraling inward toward clearings that shouldn't exist. The ground beneath our feet felt soft and yielding, like walking on flesh. And everywhere we looked, we saw signs of the others who had tried to escape. Pieces of clothing hanging from branches, personal items scattered in unlikely places, and always, the footprints of those who had walked this way before. We'd been hiking for about an hour when we found the first body. It was hanging from a tree about 20 feet off the ground, suspended by ropes that looked like they were made from human hair. The face was too decayed to identify, but the clothes matched those of David Chen from the driver's license we'd found. "He tried to escape, too," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. More bodies appeared as we continued deeper into the forest. Some hanging, some buried to the neck in soft earth, others arranged in poses that suggested they'd died while trying to run. All of them bore signs of having lived in the forest for far longer than should have been possible. Hair grown long and wild, fingernails extended into claws, teeth filed to points. They don't just copy us, I realized. They change us, transform us into something else. Into what? Into them. Into shadow walkers. The implication was clear. The figures we'd seen around our RV, the ones wearing the faces of the dead, they weren't mimics or copies. They were the actual people who had been trapped here, slowly transformed into creatures that existed to hunt and copy new victims. We were seeing our future. As the sun began to set, we found ourselves in a circular clearing that felt disturbingly familiar. In the center was a ring of stones, and within that ring, dozens of symbols carved into the earth, the same symbols that had appeared around our RV. "We've been here before," Sarah said. "That's impossible. We've been walking in a straight line." But she was right. I recognized the clearing, the specific arrangement of trees around its edge, even the particular boulder that marked the northern boundary. Somehow, despite our best efforts to navigate by compass and maintain a straight course, we'd walked in a perfect circle back to where we'd started hours ago. "The forest is alive," Sarah said, and her voice had taken on a dreamy quality that terrified me. "It's watching us, guiding us, bringing us where we need to be. Sarah, stay with me. Don't listen to them." But she was already walking toward the stone circle in the center of the clearing. "They're not evil, Marcus. They're just lonely. They've been waiting so long for someone to understand." I grabbed her arm, but she pulled away with strength that shouldn't have been possible. When she turned to look at me, her eyes were different. Still Sarah's eyes, but with something else looking out through them. "She's right, you know," said a voice behind me. I spun around to find the thing that wore my face standing at the edge of the clearing. But it looked different now. More real, more solid, like it was gaining substance while I was losing it. "We're not the monsters in this story," it continued. "We're the victims, trapped between states of being, unable to rest, unable to live. You have the chance to end our suffering. By letting you take our places, by choosing to join us willingly. When someone gives themselves freely, the transformation is kinder, faster. You wouldn't have to endure what the others did." More figures emerged from the forest, all the people who had been trapped here over the years, now transformed into shadow walkers but retaining enough of their original selves to be recognizable. They formed a circle around the clearing, watching us with expressions of patient hunger. "Join us," they said in unison. "Let us show you the peace that lies beyond fear." Sarah had reached the stone circle and was standing in its center, turning slowly as she examined the carved symbols. "I can read them now," she said. "They're beautiful, Marcus. They tell the story of everyone who came before us, everyone who chose to stop running and become part of something larger. Sarah, come back. Why?" She smiled at me, and her smile was both completely her own and completely alien. "So we can keep running? Keep being afraid? Keep fighting something we can never defeat? Because I love you. The thing that wears your face loves me too, and it will love me forever, without fear, without doubt, without the constant worry that it's not enough." She was right, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. The Shadow Walkers could offer her a version of love without human limitation, without the messy complications of grief and doubt and mortality. They could give her everything I couldn't, but it wouldn't be real, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "How do you know what's real?" The thing wearing my face stepped closer, and I could see that it had become almost solid. Its features no longer quite perfect copies, but something evolved beyond them. "You think reality is what you can touch, what follows the rules you learned as a child. But there are older rules, deeper truths. We are as real as you are. More real, perhaps, because we've learned to exist beyond the boundaries of flesh and time." Sarah laughed from the center of the stone circle, a sound like silver bells that made my chest ache. "Listen to yourself, Marcus. You're arguing about the nature of reality with a creature made of shadow and desire. Don't you see how absurd that is?" Around the clearing, the transformed victims began to move inward, tightening the circle. Their movements were hypnotic, synchronized, like dancers following music only they could hear. And as they moved, I felt something loosening inside me. Not just my resolve, but something more fundamental. My sense of self, my certainty about who I was and what I wanted. "Let go," whispered the thing with my face. "Stop fighting what you cannot change. Accept what you cannot avoid." I looked at Sarah, still turning slowly in the stone circle, her arms outstretched like she was embracing the world. She looked peaceful for the first time since her father died, free from the weight of grief that had been crushing her for months. And I realized that part of me, the part that loved her more than I feared death, wanted to give that to her. Wanted to stop being the inadequate human who couldn't fix her pain and become something that could. "That's it," said my shadow. "You're beginning to understand." But as I took a step toward the stone circle, toward Sarah and the promise of an end to struggle, something cold pressed against my palm. My father's hunting knife, still clipped to my belt. The metal was ice cold, colder than the mountain air, and the touch of it sent a shock of clarity through my fading thoughts. My father had given me that knife when I turned 16, along with advice I'd carried ever since. "When everything goes to hell, son, you hold on to what's real, what you can touch, what you can prove, what you know in your bones to be true." What I knew in my bones was that Sarah, the real Sarah, was still in there somewhere, trapped inside whatever spell or transformation was taking hold of her. And I knew that giving up now meant abandoning her to these things, no matter how beautiful they made their eternal servitude sound. I pulled out the knife. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every shadow walker in the clearing recoiled as if I'd drawn a flame, their perfect faces contorting with expressions of rage and hunger. The thing wearing my face hissed like an angry cat. "Iron," it snarled. "Cold iron, forged in fires we cannot touch. You think that primitive tool can protect you?" "I think it's real," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "And right now, that's enough." I started walking towards Sarah, keeping the knife held out in front of me. The shadow walkers pressed closer but didn't dare touch the blade, creating a narrow corridor through their ranks. With each step, I felt more like myself, less malleable, less willing to accept their version of reality. "Sarah," I called, "I need you to remember something real, something they can't copy or change." She stopped turning and looked at me with eyes that weren't quite her own. "I remember everything, Marcus. every moment of pain, every disappointment, every fear. Why would I want to keep carrying all of that? Because it's yours. Because it's what makes you human. Human is what I was. This is what I'm becoming. But even as she spoke, I could see flickers of the real Sarah beneath the surface. Small expressions, familiar gestures that the Shadow Walkers couldn't quite replicate perfectly. They could copy her appearance, her voice, even her memories. But they couldn't capture the essential spark that made her who she was. "Remember the night your father died," I said, still walking toward her. "Remember what you told me in the hospital parking lot." Her perfect composure wavered slightly. "I don't want to remember that. You said you were afraid you hadn't told him you loved him enough. You said you wished you could have one more conversation, one more chance to say everything you'd been too scared to say when he was alive. Stop. You said you understood why people believe in ghosts, because the alternative, that he was just gone, that all those words would never be spoken, was too terrible to accept. Marcus, please." But then you said something else. You said that even if you could bring him back, even if some miracle could give you that conversation, it wouldn't really be him. It would just be your grief wearing his face, telling you what you wanted to hear. Sarah doubled over as if I'd struck her, and for a moment the false serenity cracked completely. "That was different. That was this," I said, gesturing at the circle of shadow walkers surrounding us. "This is your grief wearing our faces, telling you what you want to hear, that you don't have to hurt anymore, that someone else can carry the weight of being human for you." The thing wearing my face snarled and lunged forward but stopped just short of the knife's edge. "Enough! She has chosen. We all have chosen. You cannot take that from us." "Have you?" I asked Sarah. "Or are you just too tired to keep choosing life over and over again?" She looked up at me, and for a moment her eyes were completely her own, brown and warm and full of the pain she'd been carrying for months. "I'm so tired, Marcus. I'm so tired of hurting all the time." I know. I was close enough now to reach out and touch her, though I kept the knife between us and the circling shadow walkers. "I know you're tired. I know I haven't been helping the way I should. I know I've been pulling away because I don't know how to fix this for you." "You can't fix it. No one can." "You're right. I can't fix your grief, and I can't bring your father back, and I can't promise that loving me will ever be easy or simple or without pain. But I can promise that whatever we face, we'll face it as ourselves. As real, flawed, human people who choose each other every day." The shadow walkers were growing agitated, pressing closer despite the iron knife. Their perfect faces were beginning to distort, showing glimpses of the hungry emptiness beneath their borrowed features. "Choose quickly," said the thing with my face. "The sun is setting, and in darkness, iron holds less power." I looked at the sky and saw that it was right. The last light was fading from the clearing, and with it, the knife's ability to keep the shadow walkers at bay. Soon they would rush us, and this time there would be no escape. "Sarah," I said urgently, "if you're going to choose now." She stood up slowly, and I could see the war being fought behind her eyes, the part of her that wanted peace battling against the part that wanted to remain herself. Around us, the shadow walkers began to sing again, their voices weaving together in harmonies that promised rest and forgetting and an end to all struggle. "I choose," she began, and then stopped. "Choose," the shadow walkers commanded in unison. "I choose." Sarah looked at me, and then at the thing wearing my face, and then at the figure that looked like her father. "I choose to keep hurting. I choose to keep missing him. I choose to carry this grief because it's mine, because it's proof that he mattered, that our love was real." The shadow walkers shrieked as if she'd struck them, their borrowed faces melting and reforming in rapid succession. But Sarah wasn't finished. "And I choose you," she said to me. "Not because you're perfect or because you can fix everything, but because you're real. Because when you love me, it's with your whole messy, imperfect human heart." She stepped out of the stone circle and took my free hand. The moment our skin touched, the world exploded into chaos. The shadow walkers rushed us from all sides, no longer held back by the fading power of iron or the borrowed consent they'd been trying to extract. I slashed wildly with the knife, feeling it bite into things that felt like smoke and shadow but bled like flesh. Sarah screamed and pressed close against me as claws and teeth descended from every direction. But something was wrong with their attack. Instead of the coordinated precision they'd shown before, the Shadow Walkers moved frantically, desperately, as if they were running out of time. And as they touched the knife's blade, they didn't just recoil, they began to come apart, their stolen forms unraveling like smoke in a strong wind. "The choice!" one of them shrieked as it dissolved. "Without willing consent, we cannot maintain—" Its words were cut off as it scattered into nothing, leaving only a few scraps of clothing and a wedding ring that gleamed in the dying light. All around us, the Shadow Walkers were beginning to fail. The ones who looked like Sarah's father and the other victims flickered between their copied appearances and something else. Pale, translucent figures that looked more like the ghosts they truly were than the solid beings they'd been pretending to be. "Run," Sarah said. "While they're weak." We ran, crashing through the dissolving circle of Shadow Walkers and into the dark forest beyond. Behind us, I could hear sounds of rage and despair as the creatures lost their hold on the physical world, their borrowed bodies dispersing back into the ether from which they'd been drawn. We ran without stopping, guided by nothing but desperate hope and the faint glow of stars through the canopy above. The forest seemed different now, less maze-like, more like an ordinary wilderness where it was possible to find a way out if you kept moving in the right direction. We found the road just before dawn, and an hour later, a Forest Service truck spotted us stumbling along the shoulder. The ranger who picked us up said we looked like we'd been lost for weeks. Dehydrated, scratched, wild-eyed with exhaustion. He drove us back to where we'd left our RV, but the campsite was empty. No vehicle, no gear, no trace that we'd ever been there. "You sure this is the right spot?" the ranger asked, checking his GPS. I looked around at the ordinary forest clearing, saw nothing but trees and undergrowth and a few scattered stones that might once have formed a fire ring. No symbols, no footprints, no evidence of the nightmare we'd lived through. "Yeah," I said, "this is it." The ranger filed a report about our hiking accident and arranged for us to be driven back to Portland. Our RV was eventually found 3 states away, abandoned in a truck stop parking lot with no explanation for how it had gotten there. Our camping gear was still inside, but everything electronic, phones, GPS, radio, had been completely fried, their circuits melted into useless slag. That was 6 months ago. We're still together, Sarah and I, though neither of us talks much about what happened in the Olympic National Forest. The official story is that we got lost hiking, suffered from exposure and dehydration, and imagined most of what we think we remember. The doctors say trauma can create false memories. And who are we to argue with medical professionals? But sometimes, late at night, I catch Sarah staring at mirrors with a look of deep suspicion. And sometimes I notice that our shadows move just a fraction of a second behind us, as if they're copying rather than creating our movements. We don't go camping anymore. And when people ask us about our time in the Olympic National Forest, we tell them it was beautiful, peaceful, exactly what we needed to reconnect with each other and with nature. We recommend it highly to anyone looking for a place to get away from it all, because the truth is harder to explain, and because there are some warnings that can only be delivered through experience. The forest is still there, still waiting. The road still loops back on itself, and the Shadow Walkers still dance in circles around empty campsites, singing their songs of beautiful surrender. They're patient. They can wait. And sometimes, in the small hours of the morning when sleep won't come and the world feels thin around the edges, I wonder if we really escaped at all, or if we're still there, trapped in that clearing, slowly transforming into something that only thinks it's human. After all, would we even know the difference? My name is Marcus. I'm 34, and sometimes I can't remember what my footprints looked like before I learned to be afraid of where they might lead. But I still choose to keep walking, one real step at a time, because the alternative is to stop moving altogether. And in the Olympic National Forest, nothing that stops moving stays human for very long. Story 3. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 34, and the wind through Olympic National Forest spoke my name with someone else's voice. I should have listened to that voice the first time it called. We'd been planning this RV trip for months. Myself, my husband Marcus, and our closest friends, Jake and Emma. Marcus had bought the 30-foot Winnebago used, a 2018 model with supposed low mileage, though the odometer had that suspicious digital flicker that made me wonder about its honesty. None of us had much experience with RVs, but Marcus was confident in his mechanical abilities, and Jake had convinced us that camping in the Pacific Northwest during late October would be atmospheric. He was right about that part. Olympic National Forest stretched before us like a green cathedral as we wound our way up the mountain roads that Thursday afternoon. The trees pressed close to the narrow asphalt, their trunks disappearing into mist that seemed to breathe between the branches. Marcus gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, not used to piloting something so large around these serpentine curves. "GPS says we're almost there," Emma called from the dinette behind us, her laptop balanced precariously as she tracked our progress. Staircase Rapids Campground, just like we planned. I remember feeling relieved. We'd been driving for 6 hours from Seattle, and the RV's bathroom was starting to feel claustrophobic. More than that, though, something about these woods made me want to find our spot quickly, get settled, and create some artificial boundary between us and all that wilderness pressing in from every side. The campground was nearly empty when we arrived, just 2 other RVs parked at opposite ends of the grounds, and an old pickup truck next to a weather-beaten tent. The camp host, a weathered man in his 60s with eyes that seemed to track movement in the trees, checked us in with minimal conversation. When Marcus asked about hiking trails, the man's expression darkened slightly. "Most folks stick to the marked paths," he said, handing over a laminated map. "Forest gets confused easy this time of year. Lot of morning fog, lot of trees that look the same." Jake laughed it off later as we set up camp. "Old-timers just trying to scare the city folks," he said, but I noticed he kept glancing at the tree line as he spoke. Our first night passed without incident. We grilled burgers on the RV's awning-mounted barbecue, played cards until nearly midnight, and fell asleep to the sound of rain pattering against the aluminum roof. Marcus snored softly beside me in the narrow RV bed, and through the small window I could see nothing but black forest pressing against the glass. It was the next morning when things started to feel wrong. I woke before everyone else, around 6 a.m., to the sound of someone moving around outside. At first I thought it might be other campers, but when I peered through the dinette window, the campground looked empty. The other RVs sat silent, no lights, no movement. Even that tent with the pickup truck seemed abandoned. But I could definitely hear footsteps. They weren't random, too regular, too purposeful. Someone was walking a perimeter around our RV, slow and measured. The steps would pause occasionally, as if the walker was listening or looking, then resume. I shook Marcus awake. "Someone's outside," I whispered. He groaned, rubbed his eyes, and listened for a moment. The footsteps had stopped. "Probably just a camper heading to the bathroom," he mumbled, already drifting back toward sleep. But I'd seen the campground layout. The bathrooms were in the opposite direction. When everyone finally got up around 8, I mentioned the footsteps over coffee. Emma frowned and said she'd heard something too, but thought it was an animal. Jake suggested it might have been the camp host making rounds. "At 6 in the morning?" I asked. Marcus was already studying the trail map, planning our day hike. "Let's not overthink it," he said. "We're in the woods. Woods make noise." We decided on a moderate trail called Flapjack Lakes, a 4-mile round trip that promised scenic views and relative safety. The trailhead was only a 10-minute drive from the campground, and according to the map, the path was well maintained and clearly marked. What the map didn't mention was how quickly the forest could swallow you. The trail started innocuously enough, winding through stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock. Morning mist clung to the forest floor, creating patches of limited visibility, but the path itself was obvious. Worn dirt marked with occasional orange blazes on the trees. Emma walked ahead with Jake, their voices echoing softly in the humid air as they discussed work gossip and weekend plans. Marcus and I brought up the rear, moving slowly as he stopped frequently to photograph moss-covered logs and unusual fungi. "This place is incredible," he said, crouching to frame a shot of what looked like orange coral growing from a rotting stump. So untouched. I was about to agree when I realized I couldn't hear Emma and Jake anymore. "Where did they go?" I asked, scanning the trail ahead. It curved to the right around a massive cedar, disappearing into more mist. Marcus looked up from his camera. "They were just there a minute ago." We walked faster, calling their names. Our voices seemed muffled by the dense canopy, falling flat instead of echoing. When we rounded the bend, the trail continued straight for about 50 yards before splitting into two paths. Neither route showed fresh footprints in the damp earth. "They must have taken the left fork," Marcus said, checking the map. "It's the more direct route to the lakes." But when we followed the left path for 10 minutes, calling out every few steps, we found no sign of our friends. The trail seemed to narrow as we walked, branches pressing closer until we had to duck under hanging moss and step carefully over exposed roots. That's when Marcus noticed his camera was missing. "I had it right here," he said, patting his chest where the strap should have been. "I was just using it 5 minutes ago." We retraced our steps, searching the ground, checking every fallen log and mossy boulder. Nothing. It was as if the camera had simply vanished. "Maybe it fell when we were scrambling over that deadfall," I suggested, though I didn't remember any scrambling. The trail had been clear. Marcus was growing agitated. "It's a $1,500 camera, Sarah. It doesn't just disappear." When we finally made it back to the trail junction, I realized something else was wrong. The fork we'd taken, the left path that led deeper into the forest, wasn't on the map. According to the laminated guide, the trail to Flapjack Lakes was a single route with no branches until much later. "We must have gotten turned around," Marcus said, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "We took the right fork this time, following what should have been the correct trail." The path seemed familiar at first, winding through similar stands of towering trees, but after 20 minutes of walking, we still hadn't found Emma and Jake. Worse, we hadn't encountered any other hikers or seen any of the landmarks mentioned in the trail description. The mist was getting thicker. It rolled between the trees in slow waves, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction. The forest felt increasingly claustrophobic, as if the trees were gradually moving closer together when we weren't looking. "We should head back," I said. "Find the car, drive to the ranger station, report them missing." Marcus nodded, but when we tried to retrace our route, we discovered that the trail behind us had somehow become unfamiliar. Trees that I swore we'd passed on the way in, a distinctive snag with a spiral of dead bark, a boulder split perfectly in half, were nowhere to be seen. "This isn't right," Marcus muttered, spinning in a slow circle. "We came from that direction, I'm sure of it, but every direction looked the same now. Dark trees disappearing into gray mist, the soft sound of dripping water, and underneath it all, a silence that felt like a held breath. That's when we heard Emma scream. It came from somewhere ahead and to our left, a short, sharp cry that cut through the mist like broken glass. We ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. "Emma!" Marcus shouted. "Where are you?" The scream came again, but from a different direction this time. Behind us and to the right. We changed course, stumbling over fallen logs in our haste, but when we reached the spot where the sound seemed to originate, we found nothing but more trees and more mist. A third scream echoed from somewhere ahead of us, then a fourth from the left. Each cry sounded exactly like Emma, same pitch, same terror, but they were coming from multiple directions at once. "That's not possible," Marcus whispered. I grabbed his arm. "We need to get out of here, now." But when we tried to find our way back to any kind of trail, we realized we were completely lost. The forest had closed around us like a maze, every direction looking identical. Thick trunks rose into obscurity above our heads, their branches so densely woven that almost no natural light filtered through. We walked for what felt like hours, trying to maintain a straight line, hoping to eventually hit a road or stream or some kind of landmark. The mist never lifted. If anything, it grew thicker, until we could barely see 10 feet ahead. That's when Marcus started acting strange. It began with small things. He'd stop walking suddenly, tilting his head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. He'd changed direction without explanation, leading us off whatever faint path we'd been following into deeper woods. "Where are you going?" I'd ask. "This way," he'd say. "I can hear them." But I couldn't hear anything except our own footsteps and the endless drip of condensation from the canopy above. Around what might have been afternoon, though it was impossible to tell time in the perpetual twilight under the trees, Marcus stopped abruptly and pointed into the mist. "There," he said. "Don't you see her?" I squinted in the direction he indicated. Through the gray haze, I could make out a dark shape that might have been a person standing between two trees. It was too far away and too obscured to identify, but something about its stillness made my skin crawl. "Emma," I called. The shape didn't respond. Marcus started walking toward it, and I followed reluctantly. As we got closer, the figure seemed to retreat, staying just at the edge of visibility. We pursued it deeper into the forest, always maintaining the same distance, never quite getting close enough to see clearly. "Marcus, stop," I finally said. "Something's wrong with this." But when I turned to look at him, his expression was blank, almost dreamy. His eyes were fixed on the retreating figure with an intensity that frightened me. "She's leading us somewhere," he said. "That's not Emma." He didn't seem to hear me. He kept walking, following the shape as it led us through increasingly dense undergrowth. I grabbed his sleeve, trying to pull him back, but he shrugged me off with surprising force. "Don't you want to find them?" he asked, and his voice sounded different somehow. Flatter, like he was reading words someone else had written. The figure ahead of us paused, and for just a moment, the mist thinned enough for me to see it clearly. It was tall and pale, wearing what looked like a dark dress or coat, but where its face should have been, there was only shadow. I stopped walking. "Marcus, that's not human." He turned to look at me, and for a terrifying instant I didn't recognize the person staring back. His eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated despite the dim light. When he smiled, it was with someone else's expression. "Sarah," he said, and the voice was his, but the cadence was wrong. "Why don't you trust me anymore?" I took a step backward. "What did you say?" I said, "Why don't you trust me?" But his lips didn't quite match the words, like a badly dubbed movie. The figure in the distance had vanished completely now, but Marcus continued staring at the spot where it had been. When he looked back at me, his expression was normal again. Confused, concerned. "What's wrong?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "You were." "You said—" I struggled to find words for what I'd witnessed. "You were following something that wasn't Emma." He frowned. "I thought I heard voices. Jake, maybe, calling for help. But I hadn't heard any voices. And the Marcus who had been speaking to me moments before hadn't mentioned Jake at all." We spent the rest of the afternoon, or what passed for afternoon in that timeless green twilight, trying to find our way back to anything resembling civilization. The forest seemed to shift around us, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks rearranging themselves when we weren't looking directly at them. Worse, Marcus continued to exhibit strange behavior. He'd stop mid-sentence, as if listening to a conversation I couldn't hear. He'd answer questions I hadn't asked, or ask questions that made no sense in context. "Do you remember the blue house?" he said at one point. "What blue house?" He looked at me with that same dreamy expression. "The one where we used to live, before." "Marcus, we've never lived in a blue house." But he was already walking away, following another invisible guide deeper into the maze of trees. As darkness began to fall, real darkness, not just the perpetual gloom of the forest floor, I realized we were going to have to spend the night in the woods. We had no camping gear, no food, no water except what we could collect from the constant drip of moisture around us. Marcus found a fallen log large enough to provide some shelter, and we huddled together as the temperature dropped. The forest around us erupted in night sounds. Owls, small animals moving through the underbrush, branches creaking in unfelt wind, and underneath it all, voices. They started around midnight, soft whispers that seemed to come from every direction at once. I couldn't make out words, but the rhythm was conversational, as if dozens of people were having quiet discussions just beyond the range of hearing. "Do you hear that?" I asked Marcus. He was sitting very still, head tilted in that listening posture that had become disturbingly familiar. "They're calling," he said. "Who's calling?" "All of them." He stood up slowly, like a sleepwalker. "They want us to come." "Marcus, don't." I grabbed his hand, and his skin was ice cold despite the mild night. "Please, don't leave me alone." He looked down at me, and in the faint starlight filtering through the canopy, I could see that his eyes were completely black, not just the pupils. The entire visible eye, as if he were wearing dark contact lenses. "I'll come back," he said, and pulled free of my grip. He walked into the darkness between the trees and disappeared. I called his name until my voice was hoarse, but the only response was the continuing whisper of voices that seemed to mock my desperation. Hours passed. I dozed fitfully against the fallen log, starting awake every few minutes at imagined sounds. Dawn came gray and listless, revealing a forest that looked different from the one we'd been lost in the day before. The trees were the same species, but their arrangement felt foreign, as if I'd been transported to an entirely different section of the woods. Marcus returned as the first pale light filtered through the mist. He emerged from between two massive cedars, walking with the same dreamy expression he'd worn when following the dark figure the previous day. "Where did you go?" I demanded. "I found them," he said. "Found who? Emma and Jake?" He nodded, but when I asked where they were, he gestured vaguely toward the trees. "They're waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For us to remember." The way he said it made my blood turn to ice water. This wasn't my husband speaking. Something else was using his voice, his face, his body to communicate with me. "Remember what, Marcus?" "Who we really are." I stood up slowly, my muscles stiff from sleeping on the ground. "We're Sarah and Marcus Chen. We live in Seattle. We came camping with our friends Emma and Jake." Marcus smiled, and the expression was so wrong on his familiar features that I had to look away. "No," he said gently. "That's just the story we tell ourselves, but stories end, Sarah. And when they do, we have to go back to being what we really are." "What are we really?" "Lost." The word hung in the air between us like a physical presence. In the growing light, I could see that Marcus's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his clothes looked different. Older, more worn, as if he'd been walking through the forest for weeks instead of hours. "You're not Marcus," I said. "I'm exactly Marcus," he replied. "I'm just remembering better." He turned and started walking deeper into the woods, moving with purpose for the first time since we'd gotten lost. Against every instinct screaming at me to run the other way, I followed. What choice did I have? He was my only connection to anything familiar in this maze of trees and mist. We walked for what felt like hours, though the light never seemed to change. The forest around us grew increasingly strange. Trees twisted into impossible spirals, moss that glowed faintly in the shadows, clearings where the grass grew in perfect geometric patterns. Eventually, we came to a place that shouldn't have existed. It was a small valley completely enclosed by towering trees, their canopy so thick overhead that it blocked out all but the faintest traces of sky. In the center of the valley stood what looked like a village, a collection of old wooden buildings arranged around a central square. "There," Marcus said, pointing toward the buildings. "That's where they're waiting." As we got closer, I could see that the structures were ancient, their wood weathered to the color of old bones. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and moss covered the roofs in thick green blankets. It should have been completely abandoned, but smoke rose from several chimneys and warm light glowed in some of the windows. That's when I saw Emma. She was standing in the doorway of what might once have been a general store, wearing the same hiking clothes she'd had on when we started the trail. But something was wrong with her posture, her expression. She stood too still, stared too directly, smiled too wide. "Sarah," she called, waving enthusiastically. "You made it." I wanted to run to her, to feel relief at finally finding our lost friend, but something in her voice stopped me. It was Emma's voice, but with the same flat quality I'd noticed in Marcus, as if someone was doing an impression from memory. "Where's Jake?" I asked. "Oh, he's around," Emma said, her smile never wavering, exploring. "You know how he is." But I did know how Jake was, and he would never have left Emma alone in a place like this. He was protective to a fault, sometimes annoyingly so. The Jake I knew would have stayed close, would have been hovering nervously, would have been making jokes to cover his anxiety. Marcus walked past me toward the village center, where a group of people had begun to gather. They looked like other hikers and campers, flannel shirts, hiking boots, backpacks, but they all had that same too-still quality, that same unsettling smile. "Welcome back," one of them said to Marcus, and he nodded as if he'd been expecting the greeting. "Back from where?" I asked, but no one answered. The group was growing larger, more figures emerging from the buildings and the surrounding trees. Men and women of various ages, all dressed for outdoor activities, all wearing that identical expression of vacant contentment. "Sarah," Emma said, walking toward me with deliberate steps. "Don't you remember this place? I've never been here before." "Of course you have. We all have. We come here when the stories get too heavy, when being who we pretend to be becomes too exhausting." She reached out to touch my arm, and her skin was the same cold temperature as Marcus's had been. "It's so much easier here. No jobs to worry about, no bills to pay, no complex relationships to maintain, just the simple truth of what we really are." "Which is what?" "Nothing," she said, and her smile widened until it threatened to split her face. "Isn't that wonderful?" I backed away from her, looking around at the assembled crowd. There had to be 30 or 40 people now, all watching me with that same empty expression. Some of them looked familiar. I thought I recognized a couple from the campground, and wasn't that the camp host standing near the edge of the group? "This isn't real," I said. "Real is just another story," Marcus replied from somewhere behind me, a particularly persistent one. The crowd began to move closer, not threatening exactly, but insistent. Their footsteps made no sound on the grass, and their clothes didn't rustle as they walked. "You're tired, Sarah," Emma said. "Tired of pretending to be someone you're not. Tired of carrying all those memories, all those responsibilities. Wouldn't it be nice to put them down?" And the terrible thing was, she was right. I was tired, exhausted actually, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from years of trying to be a good wife, a good friend, a good person. The weight of all those expectations, all those roles I played, felt suddenly unbearable. "Just let go," Marcus whispered, his voice coming from right beside my ear, though I couldn't see him. "Let go and forget." For a moment, I almost did. The temptation was overwhelming, to simply stop fighting, stop trying, stop being, to fade into the gray mist of the forest and let someone else deal with all the complicated business of being alive. But then I remembered something. A small thing, almost insignificant. The way Marcus hummed while he made coffee in the mornings. Not any particular song, just a tuneless little melody that never varied. It was annoying sometimes, that persistent humming, but it was distinctly his. A quirk that belonged to the real Marcus, not this hollow thing wearing his face. The real Marcus would never suggest that I let go of who I was. He loved who I was, annoying habits and neuroses and all. "You're not my friends," I said aloud. The crowd stopped moving. "You're not my husband." Emma's smile flickered for just an instant. "You're something else. Something that feeds on forgetting." The air around me seemed to thicken, like trying to breathe through cotton. The assembled figures began to waver, their edges becoming indistinct. "Sarah," the thing wearing Marcus's face said, and for the first time, its voice carried emotion. Anger, maybe even fear. "Don't fight this. You'll only make it harder on yourself." But I was already backing away, moving toward the edge of the village. The crowd followed, but they moved differently now, less like people, more like shadows given temporary form. "Where will you go?" Emma called after me. "You're lost, remember? Lost in the woods with no way home." She was right about being lost, but she was wrong about having no way home. I might not be able to find my way back to the campground or the car, but I could find my way back to myself. And that was a kind of home too. I ran. Behind me, the crowd gave chase, but their footsteps still made no sound. And when I glanced back, they seemed to be fading, becoming more transparent with each passing second. The village disappeared into the mist as if it had never existed. The strange valley with its twisted trees and geometric clearings gave way to more ordinary forest. Still maze-like, still disorienting, but recognizably natural. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, then kept walking, trying to maintain a straight line, hoping to eventually hit a road or stream or some sign of civilization. The forest gradually began to feel less oppressive. The mist thinned. Real sunlight filtered through the canopy, and I started seeing familiar landmarks. The split boulder, the spiral-barked snag, the distinctive stands of Douglas fir that had marked our original trail. It took me 3 more hours to find the trailhead, and another hour after that to locate our RV in the campground. The sun was setting by the time I collapsed on the small couch inside, shaking with exhaustion and relief. The campground was exactly as we'd left it the morning before. Our neighbors' RVs still parked in their spots, the old pickup still next to its weathered tent. But when I looked closer, I realized something was wrong. There was no RV next to our space. The spot where Marcus had parked his rented Winnebago was empty, showing only flattened grass and tire tracks. I checked the paperwork on the dinette table. According to the campground receipt, I had reserved a single tent site for 1 person. My own name was on the registration, written in my own handwriting. In my wallet, I found photos of myself camping alone, hiking solo trails, standing next to scenic overlooks with no one else in frame. My phone contained text conversations with friends back in Seattle, all asking how my solo retreat was going, all expressing admiration for my courage in taking time for yourself after everything that happened. After everything that happened. I scrolled through old messages, looking for context, trying to understand what my friends were referring to. The conversations were full of carefully vague sympathy. Thinking of you. Take all the time you need. So sorry for your loss. My loss. In a folder on my phone labeled Memorial, I found photos from a funeral. My own face, drawn and grief-stricken, standing beside a casket. The funeral program identified the deceased as Marcus Chen, beloved husband, taken too soon in a hiking accident. According to the date stamp, Marcus had died 3 months ago. I sat in the empty RV, my RV, according to the rental agreement, and tried to understand what had happened to me. Had I invented Emma and Jake too? Had I been hiking alone this entire time, talking to myself, following phantom figures through the mist? The memories felt so real. The weight of Marcus's hand in mine, Emma's laugh echoing through the trees, Jake's nervous jokes about getting lost. But maybe that's what grief does. Creates elaborate fictions to avoid facing unbearable truth. Or maybe the forest really had shown me something else. Something that lived in the spaces between memory and reality, feeding on the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of loss. I drove home the next morning, but the questions followed me. They're still with me now, months later, as I write this account. I've returned to work, resumed my normal routines, but I can't shake the feeling that part of me is still lost in those woods, still walking through the mist, still listening for voices that speak my name with someone else's cadence. Sometimes, in the early morning hours when the world is quiet, I think I can hear Marcus humming in the kitchen. Just that same tuneless melody he used to make while preparing coffee. But when I go to investigate, I find only empty rooms and the sound of my own breathing. The doctors say it's a normal part of the grieving process. Auditory hallucinations, false memories, the mind's desperate attempt to keep the dead alive through elaborate fantasies. They've given me pills to help with the episodes, therapy to process the underlying trauma, but they can't explain the photographs. Last week, while going through the pictures on my phone from the camping trip, I found one I don't remember taking. It shows the trail junction where Marcus and I first got separated from the others, or where I first started following my own delusions into the deep woods. In the background, barely visible through the mist, are 4 figures standing among the trees. The image is too distant and too blurred to make out faces, but I can see their postures, their clothing. They look like 4 people who have just realized they're lost. They look like us, I've enlarged the photo, adjusted the contrast, run it through every enhancement app I can find, but the figures remain frustratingly indistinct. Still, there's something about their arrangement, the way they stand in relation to each other, that fills me with a dread I can't quite name. Because if that photo is real, if those figures are actually there in the woods, then maybe everything I experienced was real too. Maybe there really is a place in the forest where lost people gather, where the weight of being human becomes too much to bear, where forgetting feels like the only escape from an unbearable world. Maybe Marcus didn't die in a hiking accident 3 months ago. Maybe he just got tired of carrying the story of who he was supposed to be and walked into the mist to become something simpler. Maybe Emma and Jake are real people I met on the trail, fellow travelers who made the same choice, who let themselves be forgotten rather than continue the exhausting work of remembering. And maybe, someday soon, I'll follow them. The thought should terrify me, but it doesn't. There's a strange comfort in the idea of setting down this heavy identity I've been carrying, this complex persona with its tangled relationships and pressing responsibilities, to walk into the woods and let the forest take my name, my history, my carefully constructed sense of self, to become nothing at all. The only thing that stops me is the memory of that tuneless humming, the small quirks and habits that make up a real person rather than just a story. If Marcus really is lost in those woods, becoming something that wears his face but doesn't know his songs, then maybe someone needs to remember him as he actually was. Maybe that's what the living owe the dead. Not the burden of carrying on, but the simple act of witnessing, of refusing to let their authentic selves be consumed by the gray mist of forgetting. So I write this account, and I remember, and I resist the pull of that empty village in the woods where nothing ever changes and no one ever has to be anyone at all. But on quiet mornings, when the wind sounds like voices calling my name, I can feel the forest waiting. It knows where I live now. It knows I'm tired, and it knows that someday the weight of remembering will become too much to bear, and I'll pack my bags and drive back to Olympic National Forest, back to the trails where stories go to die. When that day comes, I think I'll finally understand what the wind was trying to tell me, speaking my name with someone else's voice. It was calling me home. Story 4. My name is Marcus. I'm 34, and I parked our RV at Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas under a sky that felt like it was holding its breath. The ranger said, "Watch the weather." And I should have noticed how his eyes stayed on me a beat too long, like the sky wasn't the only thing he was warning me about. It was supposed to be a healing trip. Sarah, my wife of 8 years, had been distant since the miscarriage 6 months ago. We'd barely spoken beyond logistics. Who was picking up groceries, whose turn it was to take out the trash. The silence between us had grown so thick I could practically taste it. Dr. Brennan had suggested we needed time away from the city. From the nursery, we'd painted yellow and never had the heart to repaint. "This will be good for us," Sarah had said when I showed her the campground brochure, but her voice carried the same hollow tone she'd used to thank the nurses at the hospital. Devil's Den had seemed perfect, remote enough for privacy, developed enough for our 28-foot Winnebago. The website promised hiking trails, clear streams, and sandstone bluffs that glowed red at sunset. What it didn't mention was how the trees seemed to lean in too close, or how the shadows between them stayed dark even when the sun was directly overhead. We'd arrived Friday afternoon. Sarah spent most of the drive staring out the passenger window, occasionally pointing out landmarks with forced enthusiasm. "Look, that barn's roof is completely caved in. Those cows are all facing the same direction," small talk that felt like putting Band-Aids on a severed artery. Our campsite was at the end of a narrow gravel road, backing up to dense forest. Site 47, far enough from the main loop that other campers' voices barely carried on the wind. Perfect for what we needed, or what I thought we needed. The first night had been surprisingly normal. We'd grilled hamburgers on the little Coleman stove, shared a bottle of wine from the cooler, even managed to laugh at Sarah's story about her co-worker Janet accidentally sending a love poem to their entire department instead of her husband. For a few hours, it felt like we might actually be healing. But Saturday morning, everything changed. I woke to find Sarah already dressed, standing outside our RV with a small folding shovel in her hands. She was staring at a spot about 20 feet away, near the tree line, with an expression I'd never seen before, focused and hungry, like she just remembered something desperately important. "Morning, babe," I called through the screen door. "What's with the shovel?" She didn't turn around. "There's something here." "Something like what?" "Something buried. Right here." She pointed the shovel at a patch of ground that looked identical to every other patch of ground around our campsite. "I can feel it." I stepped outside, still in my pajama pants and undershirt. The morning air was cool enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. "Feel what exactly?" Sarah knelt down and pressed her palm against the earth. "It's warm. Right here, it's warm." I walked over and crouched beside her. The ground felt perfectly normal under my hand, slightly damp from the previous night's dew, cool from being in shade most of the morning. "Honey, I think maybe—" "No." Her voice was sharp, more focused than I'd heard it in months. "It's here. I need to dig." Before I could stop her, she'd driven the shovel blade into the soil. The sound it made was wrong somehow. Not the clean slice you'd expect, but a wet, sucking noise like breaking the seal on a vacuum-packed bag. "Sarah, we can't just dig up the campground. We'll get in trouble with the rangers." She looked up at me, and for a second, I didn't recognize my wife. Her eyes had this glassy intensity, like she was seeing something I couldn't. "This isn't about the campground rules, Marcus. This is important." She went back to digging. I should have stopped her right then. Should have taken the shovel away, suggested we pack up and find a different site, maybe even cut the trip short and head home. Instead, I found myself asking if she wanted some coffee, if she'd eaten anything yet, making normal morning conversation while my wife scraped away at the Arkansas dirt like a woman possessed. By noon, she'd carved out a hole about 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. The displaced earth formed a neat pile beside the excavation, and Sarah perched on the edge of the hole like a bird on a nest, still digging. "Find anything yet?" I tried to keep my voice light, but the situation was starting to seriously worry me. Sarah hadn't taken a break in over 4 hours. She'd refused breakfast, ignored my suggestions that we go for a hike or visit the park's visitor center. "Getting closer," she said without looking up. Sweat had darkened her blonde hair and stained her t-shirt, but she showed no signs of fatigue. If anything, she seemed energized. I noticed other things too. The campsite had gone quiet. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had stilled. The only sound was the rhythmic scrape of metal against dirt and Sarah's increasingly labored breathing. "Maybe you should take a break," I suggested. "Get some water, something to eat." "Almost there." The shovel hit something solid with a hollow thunk. Sarah's head snapped up and she smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from her since the hospital. I told you there was something here." She dropped to her knees in the hole and began scraping away dirt with her hands. I couldn't see what she'd found from where I stood, but I could hear it, a rhythmic scraping sound like fingernails on wood. "Sarah, seriously, what is it?" She didn't answer, just kept digging with her bare hands, her movements becoming more frantic. Dirt caked under her fingernails and streaked her forearms. She was breathing hard now, little grunts of effort escaping with each handful of earth she scooped away. Then she screamed. Not a scream of fear or pain, but something else. Triumph mixed with something primal and hungry. She sat back on her heels, holding something in her dirt-caked hands. It was a small wooden box, maybe 8 inches square, dark with age and moisture. The wood looked hand-carved, with symbols etched into the lid that might have been letters or might have been something else entirely. Sarah cradled it against her chest like she'd just found a lost child. "What is it?" I asked. "It was calling to me," she whispered. All night I could hear it calling. I wanted to tell her that boxes don't call to people, that she was starting to scare me, that maybe we should pack up and find a hotel for the rest of the weekend. Instead, I heard myself asking, "Are you going to open it?" Sarah's smile widened. "Not yet. It's not ready yet." She climbed out of the hole, still clutching the box, and carried it into the RV. I followed, but she'd already disappeared into the bedroom and closed the door behind her. I spent the rest of Saturday afternoon sitting outside, staring at the hole Sarah had dug. Something about it bothered me beyond the obvious weirdness of the situation. The shape was too regular, too purposeful. It looked less like random digging and more like Sarah had known exactly where to excavate, like she'd been following a map. Around 6 o'clock, I tried knocking on the bedroom door. "Sarah, you hungry? I was thinking about making some pasta." No response. I pressed my ear to the thin door and heard something that made my skin crawl. A low, humming sound, like someone singing a lullaby just under their breath. The melody was unfamiliar, but somehow it felt like something I should recognize. "Sarah!" The humming stopped. After a long moment, her voice came through the door, dreamy and distant. "I'm fine, Marcus. Just resting." I made pasta for one and ate it while watching the sun set behind the trees. The forest had gotten even quieter as darkness approached. No insect chorus, no owl calls, nothing. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. When I finally went to bed, Sarah was lying on her side of the mattress, fully clothed, with the wooden box nestled in her arms like a teddy bear. Her eyes were closed, but I could tell she wasn't asleep. Her breathing was too shallow, too controlled. "Sarah?" "Shh," she whispered without opening her eyes. "It's talking." I lay there in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to my wife whisper back to a wooden box in a language I didn't recognize. Every so often, she'd laugh softly, like someone had just told her a particularly funny joke. I didn't sleep. Sunday morning, Sarah was already gone when I woke up. The box was gone too, but the bedroom reeked of fresh earth and something else. Something organic and sour, like vegetables left too long in a warm car. I found her back at the hole, but now she was making it bigger. The excavation had tripled in size overnight, stretching almost to the tree line. Sarah stood in the center of it, now waist deep, still digging. The wooden box sat on the pile of displaced dirt, watching her work. "Jesus, Sarah, how long have you been out here?" She paused and looked up at me. Her face was gaunt, her eyes red-rimmed and glassy. Dark circles under her eyes made her look like she'd aged 10 years overnight. "Since before dawn," she said. "It told me to go deeper." "The box told you?" She nodded earnestly. "There are more boxes, Marcus. Lots more. This was just the first one. Just the one that called loudest." I stared down at my wife standing in a hole she'd dug with her bare hands. Her fingernails were cracked and bleeding. Her clothes were soaked with sweat and caked with dirt. She looked like someone who'd been buried alive and clawed her way to the surface. "Sarah, this isn't normal. This isn't healthy. I think we should look." She held up something she'd just unearthed. Another box, larger than the first, made of the same dark wood with the same strange symbols carved into its surface. "I told you there were more." As I watched, she set the second box beside the first, then immediately went back to digging. Her movements had taken on a mechanical quality, like she was a wind-up toy that someone kept cranking. That's when I noticed the smell. It started as something barely perceptible, just a hint of sweetness in the air. But as the day wore on, it got stronger, cloying and organic, like flowers left in water too long. By noon, it was strong enough to make me gag. "Do you smell that?" I called down to Sarah. She paused in her digging and took a deep breath. "Smells like coming home," she said, and went back to work. I tried to get her to eat lunch, but she ignored me. I tried to get her to take a break, drink some water, come inside where it was cool. She acted like I wasn't even there. The only thing that seemed to exist for her was the hole and whatever she expected to find in it. By late afternoon, she'd found 4 more boxes of varying sizes. They sat in a neat row on the dirt pile like a collection of dark, silent pets. Sarah had dug herself down almost 6 feet, and I had to lean over the edge to see her. "Sarah, seriously, this has to stop. You're going to hurt yourself." She looked up at me with those glassy, unfocused eyes. "Almost finished," she said. "Just one more. The big one." "The big one?" She nodded toward the far end of the excavation where she'd been concentrating her efforts. "It's down there. I can feel it humming." I couldn't hear any humming, but I could smell that sickly sweet odor getting stronger. It was coming from the hole now, wafting up like incense from a censer. As the sun set, Sarah's digging became more frantic. She was using her hands now, scooping away dirt and tossing it over her shoulder. In the fading light, she looked less like my wife and more like some wild thing that had been trapped underground. Then she found it. The sound she made when her hands hit the final box wasn't quite human. It was part laugh, part sob, part something else entirely. She fell to her knees in the dirt and began clearing away the soil with trembling hands. This box was different from the others. Larger, for one thing, maybe 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. But there was something else about it. Something that made my skin crawl even though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The wood was darker, almost black, and the symbols carved into its surface seemed to move in the failing light. Sarah, don't touch that. But it was too late. She'd already wrapped her arms around the box and was trying to lift it. The thing must have weighed 100 pounds or more because she could barely get it to shift in the dirt. "Help me," she gasped. "Help me get it out." Everything in my body was screaming at me to run, to grab my keys, get in the truck, and drive away from Devil's Den as fast as I could. Instead, I found myself climbing down into the hole. The smell was overwhelming down there, so thick I could taste it on my tongue. Sweet and rotten, like fruit that had fermented in its own juices. And underneath that, something else. Something that reminded me of the smell of the delivery room 6 months ago, when we'd lost. I forced myself to stop thinking about that. Sarah and I managed to wrestle the large box up to ground level. It was heavier than it looked, and the wood felt wrong under my hands. Too warm and slightly soft, like it was made of something that was still alive. As soon as we got it out of the hole, all the other boxes began to hum. It was barely audible at first, just a low vibration that I felt more than heard. But as Sarah knelt beside the large box and began running her hands over its carved surface, the sound got louder. Soon, it was a chorus of wooden voices, all humming the same tuneless melody Sarah had been singing in the bedroom. "Beautiful," Sarah whispered. "They're all singing together." She found the latch on the large box and began working it open. The mechanism was old and stiff, but she managed to get it loose. The lid creaked as it opened, and the smell that escaped made me double over and retch. Inside the box was something that might have once been a baby. It was small and pale and perfectly preserved, like it had been pickled in whatever fluid filled the bottom of the box. Its eyes were closed, and there was something that might have been a smile on its tiny face. Around its neck was a cord strung with what looked like teeth, small, pearl-white teeth that could have come from a child's mouth. Sarah reached toward it with shaking hands. "Sarah, no." I grabbed her wrist. "Don't touch it." She looked at me with those glassy, fevered eyes. "It's ours, Marcus. It's the baby we lost. It's been waiting for us. That's not our baby, Sarah. Our baby was cremated, I know. But this is what we should have had. This is what we deserve." She pulled her hand free and reached into the box. The moment her fingers made contact with the thing's pale skin, all 5 boxes erupted in a symphony of humming that was so loud I had to cover my ears. The thing in the box opened its eyes. They were black. Not dark brown or deep blue, but absolutely black. Like looking into the bottom of a well at midnight. And they were aware. They tracked my movement as I stumbled backward, and something that might have been recognition flickered across the creature's tiny features. Sarah lifted it out of the box, cradling it against her chest. The fluid from the box soaked through her shirt, but she didn't seem to notice. She was crying and laughing at the same time, rocking back and forth like she was soothing a real infant. "My baby," she kept saying. "My sweet baby." The thing turned its head toward me and opened its mouth. Instead of a baby's cry, what came out was a sound like wind through a graveyard, low and hollow and full of promise. That's when I ran. I made it to the RV and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the deadbolt. Outside, I could hear Sarah talking to the thing in a high, sing-song voice, the way mothers talk to newborns. But underneath her voice was something else, a wet, smacking sound, like something feeding. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course there was no signal. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and hills and whatever else lived in the Arkansas wilderness. Through the RV's windows, I could see Sarah sitting cross-legged beside the hole, holding the creature and singing to it. The other boxes sat open around her like an audience, and occasionally I caught glimpses of movement from inside them. Pale, quick things that might have been hands or might have been something else entirely. I tried starting the RV, thinking I could drive to the ranger station and get help, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. I checked the battery connections, the fuses, everything I could think of. The RV was dead. As night fell, I watched through the curtains as Sarah built a fire beside the hole. But instead of wood, she was feeding it things from the boxes. Small, pale things that writhed and squeaked as they burned. The flames burned blue-white instead of orange, and the smoke that rose from them was thick and black. The creature in Sarah's arms had grown. Not much, but noticeably. It was bigger than when she'd first pulled it from the box, and its limbs moved with more coordination. As I watched, it reached up and touched Sarah's face with one tiny hand, and she smiled down at it with an expression of pure maternal love. Around midnight, Sarah stood up and walked toward the RV. The creature was still cradled in her arms, and in the blue-white firelight, they looked like some twisted version of a Madonna and Child. She knocked on the door. "Marcus! Marcus, come out. I want you to meet your son." I pressed myself against the far wall, as far from the door as I could get. "Marcus, please. He's beautiful. He's perfect. He's everything we wanted." The knocking got louder, more insistent. "He wants to meet his daddy, Marcus. He's been asking about you." I held my breath and didn't move. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped. I crept to the window and peered through the curtains. Sarah was walking back toward the fire, but she turned once to look back at the RV. In the strange light, her face looked different, sharper, more angular, and when she smiled, I could swear I saw too many teeth. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the RV's bedroom, listening to Sarah sing lullabies outside, but the words weren't in English anymore. They were in the same language she'd been whispering to the box, all harsh consonants and rolling vowels that seemed to catch in her throat like she was choking on them. Dawn brought no relief. Sarah was still by the fire, still holding the creature, but now she wasn't alone. The other boxes had given up their contents, and 5 pale, vaguely humanoid things sat around the fire like some nightmare version of a family gathering. They varied in size from infant to toddler, all of them with the same black eyes and 2 wide smiles, and they were all looking at the RV. I knew I had to get out of there. The truck was still parked beside the RV, and maybe if the RV's electrical system was fried, the truck would still work. All I had to do was get to it without attracting attention. I waited until Sarah seemed distracted, crooning to the creature in her arms while the others swayed back and forth in some kind of ritualistic dance. Then I eased open the RV's side door and slipped out. The truck was maybe 20 feet away. I made it halfway before Sarah looked up. "Marcus," she called out happily. "Perfect timing. Come meet the family." I broke into a run. Behind me, Sarah laughed, and the sound was joined by a chorus of higher-pitched giggles from the things around the fire. The truck started on the first try. I threw it into reverse and backed away from the campsite as fast as I dared on the narrow gravel road. In my rearview mirror, I could see Sarah standing beside the fire, still holding the creature. She waved goodbye like I was just heading to the store for milk. The ranger station was empty when I got there, but the door was unlocked. I used their landline to call 911, then sat in the parking lot waiting for the police to arrive. I tried to think of how I was going to explain what I'd seen, how I was going to make anyone believe me. The state troopers arrived first, followed by paramedics, and finally the park rangers. I told them everything, about Sarah's obsessive digging, about the boxes, about the things inside them. They listened politely and took notes, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. When we got back to the campsite, it was empty. The hole was still there, bigger than ever, but Sarah and the fire and the boxes were all gone. The ground around the excavation was torn up like there had been some kind of struggle, and there were dark stains in the dirt that could have been blood. They found Sarah's body 3 days later about a mile deeper in the forest. The official cause of death was exposure and dehydration, complicated by what the coroner delicately called severe psychological distress. There was no sign of the wooden boxes or their contents. The search teams did find one thing, though. Carved into a tree about 50 feet from where they discovered Sarah's body was a message. 5 words, cut deep into the bark in Sarah's handwriting. "Marcus, they're hungry. Come home." I moved out of Arkansas 2 weeks after the funeral. Sold the house, sold the RV, bought a small apartment in Phoenix where the desert sun burns away the shadows and there's nowhere to dig except sand and stone. But sometimes, late at night, I hear humming, a low, tuneless melody that seems to come from the walls themselves. And sometimes, when I'm walking downtown or buying groceries or just trying to live a normal life, I catch a whiff of that sickly sweet smell, like flowers rotting in standing water. They found more boxes last month. Park rangers doing a routine trail maintenance discovered dozens of them buried throughout Devil's Den, some dating back over a century according to the wood analysis. The state closed that section of the park indefinitely while they tried to figure out what to do with the excavation site. But I know what they should do. They should fill in the holes, salt the earth, and put up signs warning people to stay away. Because whatever was in those boxes is still out there, still hungry, still looking for people like Sarah, people with holes in their hearts that need to be filled, people like me. The humming is getting louder.